Hey everyone, welcome back. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 941. All I see are children. At the foot of the other side of the mountain, the chaotic battle at the arched bridge was still ongoing. In the words of those in the northern complete reed continent's martial arts world, one could only be considered a true hero once they had smashed open the heads of their enemies and guzzled down their brains like wine. The battle for the bridge quickly escalated to white-hot intensity, and even the imperial guest elder from the Sacred Lotus Nation, who had been collecting treasures on the mountain up to this point, was forced to abandon all of the easily obtainable treasures to storm onto the battlefield. However, the guest elder had hatched a rather cunning ploy. He had picked out the treasures that he felt were the most valuable and hidden them on the rafters of a pavilion. As for all of the other treasures, he stuffed them into a cloth bag before tossing them down in a corner of the neighboring room. That way, Bai Bai and Zhanqing would be able to easily come and claim the treasures. As for how they were ultimately going to get these treasures out of this immortal abode, that was still yet to be seen. Gao Ling had already donned his suit of divine dew-bearing armor, and he was doing his best to protect Zhanqing with the assistance of the guest elder from the feudal lord's manor. Meanwhile, Zhanqing was putting on an act of panicked incompetence. He had built a false reputation for himself in the northern pavilion nation as a profligate and lackadaisical young man, and his arrogant words of provocation from earlier further contributed to the illusion that he was all bark and no bite. In light of all of this, no one could have imagined that he was actually an abode-tier cultivator with two incredibly destructive offensive immortal treasures at his disposal. With the Sacred Lotus Nation guest elder entering the fray, the previously one-sided battle immediately began to swing slightly in the favor of Zhanqing's party. Zhanqing was feeling particularly resentful of the female cultivator wearing the veiled bamboo hat and the cloud-top city Dao robe. She was the one who had first attempted to cross the bridge by force and ruined his easy profit scheme. Not only that, but she took an extremely measured approach in the battle that came after. She never directly clashed against either of the Vajrabhati tier martial artists, but nor did she merely act as a passive observer and allow everyone else to perish around her as cannon fodder. Whenever Gao Ling had a chance to deliver a killing blow, she would be sure to swoop in and intervene. In the span of no more than 15 minutes, she had already saved 7 or 8 people from certain death at the hands of the two Vajrabhati tier martial artists through the use of a pair of formidable defensive treasures. The female cultivator's 2 defensive bonded items were a green jade bracelet with radiant light swirling around it, and a yellow 5-dragon cushion embroidered with iridescent clouds. Even if the cushion were struck by a punch from Gao Ling, it would merely cave in and rustle audibly, but it would ultimately remain unharmed. However, with each punch that it took, the luster emanating from the 5 golden dragons embroidered on its surface was dim a little. The problem was that the jade bracelet and the cushion were able to fill in for each other interchangeably, allowing the latter the chance to return to the female cultivator's key acupoint periodically. There, it would be nurtured with spiritual energy, and once it returned, it would be fully restored to its original condition. Zhanqing's group was having to deal with attacks from over 40 people at once, and the only saving grace for them was that the teamwork from the enemy cultivators was quite lackluster. Meanwhile, the 4th and 5th tier martial artists present didn't dare to get too close, and they were mostly attacking from afar or unleashing bursts of force with their punches to disrupt the enemy. As a result, they were sacrificing all of the advantages that martial artists normally had in close-quarters combat. Otherwise, Zhanqing's group would have been under even more pressure. However, once a vagrant cultivator decided to put their life on the line, even Gao Ling couldn't help but feel a little fearful of the reckless insanity with which they fought, let alone Zhanqing, who hadn't seen much bloodshed throughout his life, and the guest elder that served his clan, who had grown accustomed to a life of secure complacency. The guest elder of the feudal lord's manor had already had a hole blown through his abdomen by a sneak attack from a powerful treasure, and the wound was bleeding profusely. It was only thanks to his physical constitution as a Vajrabhati tier martial artist that he was able to suppress the injury and continue fighting. In contrast, Gao Ling was a much more competent warrior, one that was accustomed to having to fight entire armies on his own at once at times, so he was faring much better and remained unscathed thus far. As for the Sacred Lotus Nation guest elder, he was faring even worse. He had been struck down by an offensive spirit treasure, and had it not been for Gao Ling and Zhan Qing swooping in to save the day, he would have already perished on the spot. The former had thrown a punch to nullify much of the power of the offensive spirit treasure, while the latter had used that folding fan of his to conjure up an immortal screen to protect the imperial guest elder, and it was only thanks to their combined efforts that his life was saved. However, the two Vajrabhati tier martial artists were no slouches either, and even with Wu Kun doing her best to save the lives of those around her, 7 or 8 people had already perished to the fists of the two martial artists, with all of their bodies blown to pieces. Hence, the arrival of Bai Bai was not just a nail in the coffin in a battle that was already won. Far from it, her arrival on the battlefield was as timely as it was necessary. However, before she was able to enter the fray, Residence Head Sun Qing of the Rainbow Sparrow Residence rose up into the air to oppose her. In the air around Bai Bai was a set of 18 good fortune coins bestowed upon her by the ancestral hall of the Water Dragon sect. Bai Bai was a cultivation prodigy with a natural affinity for water techniques, and the inscriptions on these coins all held very deep meanings. Furthermore, the coins harbored the remnant fortune of a fallen nation. The coins had been forged at the founding an ancient empire that the vast river once flowed through, and from there, they were spread far and wide throughout the empire, with some placed on the rafters of ancient Taoist temples, some buried in ancient tombs, and some were also kept in the imperial vault. The Water Dragon sect had managed to collect 2 sets of 18 of these coins, and one of those sets had been bestowed upon Bai Bai. These good fortune coins were considered prized treasures even in the Water Dragon sect's ancestral hall, and they had both offensive and defensive capabilities. Even so, Bai Bai had still summoned an additional bonded item of hers, namely a guqin by the name of Scattered Snow, which was the most prized creation of an exceptional guqin craftsman in the history of the northern complete reed continent. With these 2 golden core tier cultivators duking it out, the battle had become even more intense. Right at this moment that accursed voice rang out once again urging, "Everyone, let's target the feudal lord's son. The others will be forced to protect him." Zhan Qing was furious. Whoever this woman was, she was the cause of all of this trouble, and whenever she spoke, her words always had a pivotal effect. The problem was that she was using some secret technique to speak directly into the minds lakes of everyone at once, making it impossible for Zhan Qing's group to pinpoint exactly who she was. The 2 Vajrabhati tier martial artists wouldn't dare to stand by and allow Zhan Qing to be killed, but if they dedicated too much attention and effort to protecting him, then they would be putting themselves at risk. If something were to go wrong, then perhaps even Bai Bai's attention would be diverted. Zhan Qing was certain that if one of these Vajrabhati tier martial artists were to perish in battle or sustain debilitating injuries that would render them unable to fight, then these enemy vagrant cultivators and martial artists would only become more reckless and emboldened by the morale boost. From the very beginning, Zhan Qing had urged the 2 Vajrabhati tier martial artists to be selective with their targets. Ideally, they would work together to eradicate small groups of 3 or 4 people at once. That would serve to intimidate everyone else and prevent a situation in which one would be so maddened by the loss of a close friend that they would be willing to throw their life away for a shot at vengeance. However, the chaos of the situation rendered all of Zhan Qing's careful planning completely futile. Given the state of the battle, Gao Ling and the 2 guest elders were stretched so thin that they didn't have the time and composure to pick and choose their targets. There were simply too many enemies to deal with at once, and there were no underhanded tricks that these vagrant cultivators wouldn't resort to in order to try and gain an advantage. Only now did Zhan Qing begin to regret his own conceitedness. He had thought that all of the fated opportunities in this place were his for the taking. With the combined powers of his group, it wouldn't have been a difficult task for them to slay even a nascent tier cultivator, so he had thought that they would be able to eradicate a fractured bunch of vagrant cultivators with ease. Instead, he should have taken a divide-and-conquer approach, picking off his enemies one by one. Having already made himself a public enemy to everyone, it was too late for him to back down, and he only had himself to blame for the awkward and perilous situation that he was in. It couldn't really be said that Zhan Qing had made a miscalculation. Instead, it was simply the case that the path of cultivation was rife with unpredictable twists and turns, and any false move could lead one to pay the ultimate price. With a sinking heart, Bai Bai discovered that even though she was a golden core tier direct disciple of the Water Dragon sect's ancestral hall, She was no match for the young female cultivator standing in her way. Even though Sun Qing was wearing a veiled hat to conceal herself just like Wu Kun, Bai Bai quickly realized who she was dealing with, and she immediately began communicating with her opponent through her mind's lake. I know who you are. You're Sun Qing of the Rainbow Sparrow residence. Do you understand what you're doing right now? If you kill me, you'll be making an enemy out of the entire Water Dragon sect. Our upper 5 tiers patriarch can smash your Rainbow Sparrow residence to bits with ease. Bai Bai hadn't made this declaration for everyone to hear because ultimately, as an official immortal, she had more things to consider and weigh up than vagrant cultivators, who were able to act with reckless abandon. Sun Qing was using her offensive immortal treasure to eradicate all of the snowflakes that arose as Bai Bai strummed her fingers over the strings of her scattered snow guqin, and she smiled as she replied, I have no idea what you're talking about. Sun Qing, do you really want to fight me to the death here? Bai Bai snapped in a furious manner. With the 18 good fortune coins protecting her from all directions, Bai Bai wasn't having too much trouble warding off Sun Qing's attacks. Furthermore, she wasn't even making use of the good fortune coin's offensive capabilities, so she clearly still wasn't going all out. On top of that, all official immortals of her caliber had some trump cards up their sleeves that would allow them to take down an enemy with them or flee from a battle in the blink of an eye. Hence, Bai Bai's fury and frustration didn't stem from any notion that she would lose her life here. Instead, it came from the fact that she had lost the sole claim that she thought she had over this immortal abode. On top of that, she had also lost some of her dignity as a golden core tier cultivator, but even so, her situation was much better than Jian Qing's. Sun Qing continued to play dumb, grinning as she said, Us vagrant cultivators don't believe in sparring. If we're going to fight, then it always has to be to the death. Bai Bai took a deep breath, and her mental state instantly became as tranquil as a still pond. In the blink of an eye, she had cast aside all distractions, and she had even become completely uncaring of Jian Qing's situation. Seeing as there was no way for her to talk her way out of a fight, she would just have to focus wholeheartedly on the battle at hand. Sun Qing was looking very composed and relaxed, much more so than Bai Bai, who had only recently reached the golden core tier. However, in reality, she wasn't taking her opponent lightly at all. She knew that she was facing a young prodigy from an extremely formidable immortal sect, and she was waiting for an opportunity to strike down her opponent in one blow. If and she would only resort to negotiation as an official immortal if such an opportunity failed to present itself. If her opponent proved to be the superior cultivator and managed to kill her in battle, then she would simply accept her fate. She fully intended to kill Bai Bai if given the chance, so her opponent was naturally allowed to do the same. While traveling with Lu Jinglong, who seemed more like a schoolteacher than a swordsman to her, he had once said to her that there was no one under the heavens who couldn't die. Having said that, that was only the first half of his quote, which concluded with, However, everyone under the heavens can be reasoned with. Sun Qing had never agreed with that second assertion, and she felt it to be completely pointless, but she had romantic feelings for him, so she never contested him on the matter. Of course, if she really had tried to engage Lu Jinglong in a debate about principles, then she would have surely suffered a catastrophic defeat. Back then, Lu Jinglong had only been a golden core tier swordsman, but armed with nothing more than that mouth of his, he had managed to convince a bloodthirsty unpolished jade tier monster to change his ways. Not only that, but that old monster had become something between a friend and a rival of his, and he had served as their guardian for a small part of their journey, escorting them safely out of his territory. During their chance encounter last time, the two of them had run out of conversation topics after exchanging some initial greetings and small talk, so she asked him about this matter. In response, Lu Jinglong told her that he had met with the old senior during an earlier journey to the south, and they had thoroughly enjoyed each other's company. However, the old senior had told him to focus on making a breakthrough once he returned to the Great Emblem Sword sect, and that there was no need to visit again before then. There weren't many bodies on the ground in the palace at the foot of the mountain that Chan Ping'an had been assigned to. After silently apologizing for his intrusion, he crouched down beside the nearest set of skeletal remains before picking up its hand for an examination. In doing so, he discovered that it was no different from a normal set of skeletal remains, and didn't have the unnaturally bright white coloration of the skeletons that had been tainted by yin energy on the skeleton shoal. The same applied to the skeletal remains on the other side of the mountain, which meant that none of the cultivators that had perished here had even reached the golden core tier during their living days. Another strange observation made by Chan Ping'an concerned the two sets of skeletal remains seated across the go table from one another in that pergola from earlier. They had been wearing Dao robes of an extremely high caliber, yet after those Dao robes were stripped off by Huang Shi, Chan Ping'an noticed that those two bodies also didn't display the signature golden branches and jade leaves seen in golden core tier cultivators. Just like everywhere else, the palace that Chan Ping'an had stepped into was abundant with spiritual energy and didn't strike him with any sense of discomfort. Thus, he wasted yet another yang energy illumination talisman. The spoils that he was able to reap from this palace were quite lackluster, consisting of only a few severely damaged immortal treasures. As expected, he had to travel with Taoist Master Sun in order to be blessed with good fortune. He arrived at a dried pond that was filled with withered leaves. This entire time, Chan Ping'an had been thinking about the passage of text at the entrance of the chamber outside. Whoever had left those inscriptions had to have entered this immortal abode at some point. Hence, it was either something left behind by a benevolent individual to serve as a clue for those who came after him, or it had been left behind by the orchestrator of a sinister trap, who was afraid that the fish would be too stupid to take his bait without some guidance. Chan Ping'an leaped over the railing and into the pond, then picked up a handful of dried leaves, and they instantly crumbled in his grasp without displaying any special properties. Sure enough, the water fortune on the backside of the mountain was most abundant near that bamboo tree. It just so happened that Downtrodden Mountain was missing a good bamboo tree. The ancestral bamboo that Wei Bo had cherished like a prized treasure on Go Table Mountain had been able to produce generations after generations of bamboo trees, eventually giving rise to a lush bamboo forest, and in Chan Ping'an's eyes, that was exactly what Downtrodden Mountain was missing. Of course, in his eyes, Downtrodden Mountain was missing everything. He pinched some soil between his fingers, and just the dried leaves. The soil also quickly crumbled away at the slightest pressure. Chan Ping'an knew a decent amount about the vast river of the northern complete reed continent. However, he knew very little about its history. He had only heard from Wei Bo that there had once been a vast river flowing into the sea from the flowing Dawn continent in the east into the sea in the west. The river stretched for 15,000 kilometers, and wherever it converged with a mountain, a bunch of sages and earth immortals would be sure to arise from there. There was also a vast river on the circling Ascension continent that had been intercepted at a certain point by a much smaller river, which in turn flowed into the sea. As a result, the entire vast river was compromised, and in no more than 300 years it ceased to exist. This meant that all of the river gods and river guardians in that vast river were also doomed. There had been many complex rites and rules pertaining to the appointment of deities along the vast river, and the decisions went far beyond the jurisdictive powers of the rulers that presided over the empires and nations littered along the length of the river. In fact, it was said that they had to consult with the Confucian school on the Middle-earth divine continent over this matter. Chan Ping'an looked around to ensure that there was no one else around, then removed his sword-nurturing gourd from his waist before bringing it to his lips and tipping his head back, downing all of the remaining spirit water inside in one go. After that, he directed his consciousness inward and made his way to his water palace. Upon his arrival, the gates of the water palace had been flung wide open. There was a green river flowing along beside Chan Ping'an's feet, and countless streams of water were flowing into it from all directions, forming this river that flowed into the pond in the water palace. All of the green-robed children were busy at work, and they didn't even bother to spare him a glance as they rushed back and forth in excitement and elation. Chan Ping'an felt a little guilty and forlorn upon seeing this. The green-robed children were only this ecstatic because they had a master who had neglected them for so long, albeit not by choice. He then paid a visit to his mountain shrine. There was actually an even thinner stream of water that flowed out of his water palace and into the key acupoint that was home to his mountain shrine. Due to the fact that all of the water fortune had already been intercepted by the water palace, this stream of water was completely clear and colorless, with none of the green tinge from before. Upon entering the acupoint where the mountain shrine was situated, the stream of water would seep into the ground and nourish the earth as spiritual energy. After some contemplation, Qian Ping'an withdrew his consciousness from his inner small world, and he didn't linger in this palace any longer. Instead, he snuck his way to the bamboo tree that was extremely likely to have come from Azure Divine Mountain, making sure to display a level of speed fit for a Dragon Gate tier cultivator that he was posing as the entire way there. Upon his arrival, he gave the bamboo tree a slight shake, then guided all of the remaining water droplets clinging to its leaves into his sword-nurturing gourd. Qian Ping'an was quite pleased with himself, and after strapping his sword-nurturing gourd back to his waist, he began climbing up the bamboo tree, but to his surprise, he was unable to snap the thin bamboo branches that looked as if they could have been snapped easily even by a child. Qian Ping'an cast his gaze toward the Taoist temple in the distance, only to discover Huang Shi standing atop a wall, having already been observing him for quite some time. Qian Ping'an feigned an embarrassed expression, pretending as if he had only just spotted Huang Shi, then gave him a smile and a wave. Huang Shi dropped back down to the ground, shaking his head in dismay at how desperate and pathetic Qian Ping'an was. Without having to worry about Huang Shi's intrusive gaze, Qian Ping'an bent down a branch of the bamboo tree to try and pluck off some leaves. This task should have been just barely doable for a Dragon Gate tier cultivator, and he plucked off handfuls after handfuls of leaves before stuffing them into one of the cloth bags slung over his shoulder. The bag had been completely empty when he first started, but it was soon bulging with nothing but bamboo leaves. Huang Shi had gone elsewhere to continue observing Qian Ping'an from afar, and he couldn't help but admire the latter's complete lack of shame. If even after all of this, Qian Ping'an turned out to actually be an unfathomably powerful cultivator posing as an incompetent fool, then Huang Shi would chop his own head off using Di Yuanfeng's Dao Saber. Only after Huang Shi had truly departed did Qian Ping'an join his index and middle fingers, using them as sharp blades and lashing out swiftly to chop off the bamboo branches at different heights before quickly stowing them away into his minimization treasure. His pocket treasure and minimization treasure weren't able to hold any more glazed roof tiles and floor bricks, but these slender bamboo branches were perfect for filling in the gaps, and after he was done, both treasures were truly completely filled to the brim. Qian Ping'an wound his arms around the bamboo tree and stayed up there for a long while, reminiscing about climbing up trees to catch cicadas with his two closest childhood friends, one of whom had become accustomed to protecting him, while the other was someone that he was always protecting and considered to almost be family. He had led a very impoverished life back then, but he seemed to never have any concerns or worries year after year. Qian Ping'an heaved a faint sigh. Before long, a mocking voice rang out in the distance. "What ya doing up there, brother Qian? It's nice and cool up here, and the view is great." Qian Ping'an chuckled as he turned to discover none other than Di Yuanfeng. Judging from his pale complexion, he was clearly still suffering from the effects of the injuries that he had sustained earlier. Di Yuanfeng turned his gaze away from Qian Ping'an, who clearly had a screw loose, directing his attention toward the nearest cluster of buildings that made up the Taoist temple as he asked, "How have Taoist Master Sun and Brother Huang been faring?" "The three of us are all doing quite well," Qian Ping'an replied with a smile. Di Yuanfeng couldn't help but take a glance at Qian Ping'an's cloth bags, all of which were filled with tiles and bricks, and really wanted to ask Qian Ping'an why he was so intent on collecting all these building supplies. Could it be that he intended to build himself a house with this stuff? Unfortunately, Qian Ping'an wasn't able to read minds. Otherwise, if he could glean Di Yuanfeng's thoughts, then he would definitely be inclined to praise the latter as a clairvoyant. Huan Yun had already made some very bountiful returns, having filled an entire pocket treasure. The Dragon Gate tier guest elder from Cloudtop City was clearly also very pleased, carrying a large bag on his back and two more in his hands with a look of unbridled joy on his face. After the two old men reconvened, they stood together on the top floor of a pavilion to observe the battle taking place down below. "It really is a dog-eat-dog world," the guest elder chuckled. Huan Yun merely smiled and said nothing. On the path of cultivation, it was often the case that falling behind one step meant that one would continue to fall behind every step of the way. If Shenzhen's two direct disciples didn't have Huan Yun as a Dao guardian, they would have very likely entered this place after Zhan Qing's group, in which case they would have been swept up into that battle like everyone else. However, Huan Yun had a very keen pair of eyes, and he immediately saw through the disguises of the two Rainbow Sparrow residence cultivators, identifying that they were most likely Sun Qing and Wu Kun. As for the guqin-wielding female cultivator up in the sky, Huan Yun had also been able to identify the instrument in her hand as the legendary scattered snow. The guqin was once a bonded item of a nascent tier female cultivator of the water dragon sect. This female cultivator was renowned for a breathtaking battle that she had taken part in on the bank of the vast river. At the time, she was able to completely dominate another nascent tier cultivator thanks to this very same guqin and the environmental advantage of being in close proximity to the vast river. At the moment, its new owner was only able to unleash around half of the guqin's full power. Should we leave this place in secret and get through that caisson ceiling, or should we go around to the back of the mountain and take a look there? The guest elder asked. We are the Dao Guardians, so we should let the two kids decide. Huan Yun replied with a smile. As long as we conceal ourselves well and don't voluntarily enter the fray, we should have nothing to worry about. Huan Yun took a glance up at the sky overhead, then turned his gaze to the distance, where the boundary of the small world lay. The unsettling observations that Bai Bai had made naturally hadn't escaped Huan Yun's notice. However, he had already secretly buried a talisman underground where the caisson ceiling at the entrance of this immortal abode was, and as long as that talisman was still there, they would have a way out. Furthermore, even though there were many suspicious and concerning signs littered throughout this place, its aura wasn't tainted by any sinister energies, and that was very reassuring to Huan Yun. A facade was easy to create, but it was very difficult to disguise the aura of a place. Even if a nascent tier great demon were to conjure up an illusion of an immortal paradise, a cultivator like Huan Yun, who was a master of the talisman branch, would still be able to identify some telltale signs and quickly realize that there was foul play afoot. In the beginning, there were actually many branches of Taoism in the majestic world, and all of them coexisted in harmony. However, at this point, many previously thriving branches had gradually fallen into ignominy or died out altogether. An example was the Sword Immortal branch, which had once been the most prominent Taoist branch on the Middle-earth divine continent, that had been a truly mighty entity that dwarfed almost all others. Even though at the time, the northern complete reed continent was rife with swordsmen and had many sword immortals, the swordsmen of the continent still didn't dare to declare that they had claim over most of the sword Dao fortune in this world. Back then, Taoist sword immortals had been one of the top 4 factions of the cultivation world that one didn't want to make an enemy out of, ranking alongside swordsmen and saber-lending cultivators. At the time, the Taoist saber room still hadn't risen to prominence, and the Taoist sword immortal faction had never identified themselves as swordsmen. After briefly reminiscing about the history of the Taoist branches, Huan Yun couldn't help but feel a hint of sorrow at the sight of the brutal skirmish taking place at the foot of the mountain. From his perspective, all those putting their lives on the line to fight for fated opportunities at the foot of the mountain were at the age of juniors and children. For some reason, he thought of a quote from a sage among poets. All I see are children, all with rocky intent. An annotation was later made on this particular phrase, reading, Rocky is the antonym to smooth. Hence, this quote denotes the complexity of human nature, and how rocky and unpredictable the human heart can be. Far more so than a rugged path stretching for thousands of kilometers deep through the mountains. Huan Yun thought back to the hint of greed and killing intent that he had almost been overcome by earlier, and he felt even more forlorn. In the eyes of the sages of 3 teachings, they were all children. All of a sudden, Huan Yun said, You go keep an eye on those 2, I'll go to the foot of the mountain to try and mediate. The fewer the lives lost, the better. The old guest elder wanted to say something to discourage him, but he quickly understood Huan Yun's intentions, and he nodded in response. Unless their group of cloud-top city cultivators could leave this place right away, it was very likely that they would be implicated by the battle taking place down below. In particular, if that direct disciple of the Water Dragon sect were to perish, then the wrath of the Water Dragon sect's upper 5 tiers patriarch would come crashing down upon the Northern Pavilion Nation and the Sacred Lotus Nation in full force, and neither the Rainbow Sparrow residents nor Cloudtop City would be spared. In fact, it was very likely that whoever reaped the most benefits here would be dealt the heaviest blow. Furthermore, if Huan Yun could mediate this conflict and convince everyone to come up with an agreeable compromise for both sides through peaceful negotiation, then he would be doing a favor to all factions involved, including the Water Dragon sect, the Rainbow Sparrow residents, and the feudal lord's manor. Huan Yun pulled out a talisman before handing it to the old Cloudtop City guest elder, then smiled as he said, If you encounter any trouble, use this talisman, and I'll arrive on the scene right away. The Dragon Gate tier guest elder tucked the talisman away, then vanished from the spot in a flash. Left on his own, Huan Yun was mentally preparing himself for the task that he was about to undertake. Serving as mediator in a heated battle was not an easy undertaking, and even a slight misstep could result in him becoming an enemy to both opposing factions. Die. After arriving on the battlefield, Huan Yun assisted neither side while also helping both sides, unleashing a flurry of talismans to try and interfere with everyone and draw the battle to a forced conclusion. At the same time, he was speaking to everyone in earnest, telling them that there were plenty of fated opportunities to be claimed in this place, and that if they trusted him, then they could all scale the mountain to search for treasures together instead of engaging in further senseless bloodshed here. Thus, the state of the battle quickly turned from a turbulent river into a tranquil lake, and everyone was suddenly willing to listen to reason. After the battle had died down, Huan Yun called upon 5 people for a private discussion. The 5 people consisted of Zhan Qing, Sun Qing, Bai Bai, and 2 prominent figureheads among all of the vagrant cultivators present. It was agreed upon by everyone that both sides would take a step back from the arched bridge. Of course, Zhan Qing and Bai Bai's group had to take a bigger step back, and the reason for this was very simple. If the battle continued in this fashion, then it was very likely the case that the only one that would survive would be Bai Bai, who would be forced to flee the scene. Of course, the other side was sure to suffer severe casualties as well. At the very most, only 10 of them would survive, and if they were unlucky, perhaps so few of them would survive that the final number of survivors could be counted off on one hand. Hence, Huan Yun's intervention was a God-sent blessing for everyone. Otherwise, no one could back down in the midst of such a heated battle, and the conflict would only be settled once one side had been completely annihilated. At the same time, under Huan Yun's watch, the 2 sides worked out a rough compensation scheme for all those who had perished in the battle. After a private conversation between Huan Yun and Bai Bai through their minds' lakes, the latter immediately forked out a sum of immortal coins to Sun Qing and the 2 figureheads of the vagrant cultivators for them to hand out as compensation as they saw fit. On Zhan Qing and Bai Bai's side, the Vajrabadi tier guest elder of the feudal lord's manor had perished, while Gao Ling had also sustained severe injuries, with his suit of dew armor already on the verge of destruction. As for the imperial guest elder from the Sacred Lotus Nation, he wasn't faring much better. On top of that, Zhan Qing had lost his prized folding fan, which he was still yet to refine into a bonded item, and only the heavens knew if it had fallen into the river or been taken in secret by some conniving vagrant cultivator. At the moment, Zhan Qing was looking completely bedraggled, with his Dao robe torn to shreds, and he had completely lost his elegance and flair as the young master of the feudal lord's manor. Even though his clan had lost an all-important Vajrabadi tier guest elder, Zhan Qing didn't complain to Bai Bai at all. Instead, he remained as composed as ever and allowed Bai Bai to make all of the decisions in his stead, something that pleased Bai Bai greatly. During this time, Sun Qing had also spoken to Bai Bai in secret through her mind's lake, declaring, "Our Rainbow Sparrow residence is willing to help you hold out until the seniors of your Water Dragon sect arrive to claim ownership of this place, and we'll do our best to prevent Cloudtop City from leaking the news to other sections. However, if Shenzhenza arrives with formidable cultivators from other sects before the cultivators of your Water Dragon sect can get here, then the cultivators of our Rainbow Sparrow residence will leave right away and play no further role in all of this." Bai Bai's impression of Sun Qing took a drastic turn at this proposal. Earlier, both of them had held back during their battle, but for everyone else aside from Huan Yun, it was very difficult to identify this fact. Thus, after they established this verbal agreement, Bai Bai decided that perhaps it was worth establishing some private ties with the Rainbow Sparrow residents in the future. Huan Yun was very relieved to see negotiations going so smoothly. It was easy to play the role of mediator, but it was a role that was very difficult to play well. It wasn't just a simple matter of dissuading people from battle. The key was understanding everyone's wants and intentions, and using that understanding to orchestrate a peaceful resolution. On the mountain summit where the Taoist temple once stood, a tall and imposing old man appeared out of thin air, then took a glance at the mountainous pile of ruins that was all that remained of the temple with a forlorn shake of his head. From there he slowly made his way to the top of the steps, then sneered. "They think that's the end of the matter? Are there really fated opportunities in this world that are this easy to come by? Human nature dictates that humans will be the ones to kill the most humans. Otherwise, where's the fun in watching a bunch of children fight and squabble? He was only able to linger at the top of the steps and look down at the two sides that had reached a truce for a brief moment before his ethereal body was destroyed by that streak of sword chi. However, right before that, he gently stomped a foot down onto the ground, and the green river at the foot of the mountain instantly began to display a reaction. First, the surface began rippling incessantly, and before long, the entire river was churning violently. Huan Yun was the first to detect this disturbance, and he swept both sleeves through the air to release a flurry of talismans. However, the water of the river under the bridge abruptly fell still, following which an azure-robed deity that stood at over 50 feet tall emerged from each end of the arched bridge. One was wielding a silver spear, while the other was holding a steel truncheon, and they both stepped ashore before stopping where they stood. At the same time, an ethereal mass of cloud and mist appeared on the arched bridge before forming a divine maiden in white. She had a pair of expressionless golden eyes, and she was holding a scroll that resembled a prized Taoist edict. She drifted up into the air before unfurling the scroll, then began to speak in a voice as delightful as a heavenly choir. Even someone of Huan Yun's immense knowledge and experience felt the words from the divine maiden to be utterly absurd, but at the same time, he did believe her to an extent. According to her, this was the place from which an ancient spiritual master once ascended after attaining the Great Tao, and at some point it had been ranked the 36th small world and 71st blessed land. It was a sacred place of peace, so by barging their way into this place, Huan Yun and everyone else had both stumbled upon a fated opportunity and committed a severe transgression. Prior to this spiritual master's ascension, he had passed down an edict upon this trio, which decreed that for all the cultivators who entered this place following his ascension, the magnitude of the fated opportunity that they attained would be determined by the number of treasures they managed to obtain. At the end, 5 people would be left, and not only would they get to keep all of the treasures that they had obtained, the first and foremost one among them would become a direct disciple of the ascended spiritual master, while the other 4 would temporarily be unofficial disciples. Additionally, they would all be granted a Taoist cultivation art that would support their cultivation all the way to the immortal tier. Over the next 10 days, only 5 people could survive. Otherwise, all of the aforementioned terms would be scrapped. Not only would no one be able to leave with any fated opportunities, everyone would be struck down on the spot by a heavenly tribulation. As direct and unofficial disciples, they had to take it upon themselves to eradicate all of the other intruders that had dared to desecrate this sacred place. Otherwise, they were not worthy of attaining this fated opportunity. All of a sudden, the unfurled scroll swelled drastically in size and transformed into a screen of water that cascaded down from the heavens to the earth like a waterfall. There were 5 portraits displayed upon the screen of water, depicting the 5 people who had claimed the most treasures up to this point. Elsewhere, slightly smaller screens of water had appeared over other parts of the mountain wherever there were people, and even though the divine maiden in white wasn't speaking very loudly, her voice was clearly audible throughout the entire immortal abode. Shen Zhen's male disciple, the one in possession of the white jade brush pocket treasure, was completely rooted to the spot. Not only was among the top 5 beneficiaries, he was ranked second. His female companion was both elated and concerned at this revelation. The one who ranked at the very bottom among the 5 was none other than Di Yuan Feng. His complexion was still slightly pale from his injuries, and just like Shen Zhen's male disciple, he was astonished to see himself on the list. The 4th-ranked treasure hunter was Huang Shi, who was standing in front of a stone plaque in the Taoist temple with his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed. Ranked above him in 3rd was Taoist Master Sun, who was already sweating profusely from the exertion of having to carry such a heavy load of treasures. As for the top-ranked treasure hunter on the list, that was none other than the black-robed old man who was still clinging to the bamboo tree high up from the ground. It was Chun Ping'an. The scroll displayed an image of Chun Ping'an in real time, and he scratched his head with a look of genuine shock and befuddlement on his face as he exclaimed, "There must be a mistake." The divine maiden in white and the 2 azure-robed deities had already vanished. The screens of water would reappear once more in 5 days. If there were still more than 5 survivors in this place at the end of the 10 days, then a heavenly tribulation would descend to strike down everyone. Huan Yuan discovered that the talisman that he had buried under the caisson ceiling had already been destroyed, leaving him with no way out. Over at the arched bridge, everyone had begun taking wary looks at one another. Huan Yun had only just brought everyone together under some semblance of harmony and cohesion, but in the blink of an eye, all of his hard work was undone, and all of a sudden, it was once again every man for himself. Even the 6 people that had gathered to negotiate terms had each taken a step back to distance themselves from everyone else. The only exceptions were Bai Bai and Zhang Qing, who were standing close to each other, communicating in secret. It had become so quiet that even the slightest pin drop could have been audibly heard, and the 2 young cultivators from Cloudtop City were growing more concerned by the second. Will Spiritual Master Huan really be able to protect us, senior brother? The young woman asked. I'd say Spiritual Master Huan would already be doing us a massive favor by not coming after us himself, the man replied with a wry smile, much to the horror of his female companion. Ultimately, Spiritual Master Huan is not a cultivator of our Cloudtop City. The only one that we can place our trust in now is Guest Elder Su, the young man said in a resigned manner. The 2 of them immediately began racking their brains for a way out of this predicament, but despite their best efforts, they were unable to come up with any sound plans. Shortly thereafter, the Dragon Gate tier guest elder that was their true Dao guardian arrived on the scene with a grim expression, then proposed, "How about you give that brush to me, and I'll divert everyone's attention away from you?" "Thank you, guest elder Su," the young man said in a grateful manner as he handed over his pocket treasure without any hesitation. The old guest elder carefully tucked the brush up his sleeve, then promptly departed, while the young woman looked on with a surprised expression. The man shook his head, gesturing for her not to speak. The young woman wasn't as meticulous and steadfast as her senior brother, and she was always being scolded by Shen Junzi for it, but even she knew that handing over the pocket treasure to the guest elder at a time like this definitely wasn't a good thing. "If I didn't hand over the brush, the 2 of us would already be dead by now," the man explained through his mind's lake. "If all 3 of us manage to survive until 5 days later, then the pocket treasure will naturally return to me." "But wouldn't it just be taken again?" the woman asked with a bleak expression. "Yes, but what else can we do?" the man asked with a smile. Tears began streaming down his female companion's face, and he gently caressed them away for her in silence. It wasn't that he didn't want to say something, it was just that he had nothing to say. Under the bamboo tree on the backside of the mountain, Di Yuanfeng took a glance up at Chan Ping'an with a grim expression. However, he had no intention of trying to confront Chan Ping'an for his treasures. Instead, he intended to get as far away as possible before going into hiding. Thus, he rushed down the mountain without any hesitation, then skirted his way around the Taoist temple. Chan Ping'an slid down from the bamboo tree, and Huang Shi took no action even as he passed by the Taoist temple, leaving Chan Ping'an to wonder what Huang Shi's plans were. Taoist Master Sun removed the 2 cloth bags from his shoulders before setting them down by his feet. He didn't dare to abandon the bags and run away for fear that he would be hunted down anyway. He could only pray that the next group of people that he came across would be content with only taking his treasures and sparing his life, at which point he would be able to make it clear to everyone that had been robbed of his treasures and would no longer be among the top 5 beneficiaries of this immortal abode. In this situation, it wouldn't do him any good even if he were truly an official immortal of the Lightning God manner. Chan Ping'an was very pleased with Taoist Master Sun upon seeing this. It seemed that he had finally wisened up for once and wasn't just abandoning his treasure and running away like before. Taoist Master Sun cast a pitiable gaze toward Chan Ping'an, who was watching him from atop a nearby wall, and there were tears swimming in Taoist Master Sun's eyes as he waved a dismissive hand to shoo Chan Ping'an away. "Get out of here. Get as far away from here as you can. Take care," Chan Ping'an said with a parting nod, but prior to his departure, he tossed 3 talismans Taoist Master Sun's way, all of which were steel-carrying talisman for concealment purposes. At this point, offensive talismans were largely pointless. After telling Taoist Master Sun how to use the talismans through his mind's lake, Chan Ping'an rushed his way down the mountain. Taoist Master Sun caught the talismans, and by the time he looked up, Chan Ping'an was already nowhere to be seen. "It really is only in times of calamity that your true friends are revealed," he sighed. Chen Ping'an's only hope was that Taoist Master Sun would be able to temporarily ensure his own survival by sacrificing his treasures. If he could survive this immediate ordeal, then there was a chance that he would be able to survive to the end. A similar story had unfolded back in the Lotus Flower-blessed land. After a series of horrific battles, armed sage Cheng Yuanshan was able to survive to the very end without engaging in a single battle, and if he had arrived on the top of the city wall in a timely fashion, then he would have even secured an opportunity to ascend to the majestic world without having to shed a single drop of blood, whether it be of his own or others. As for the purported opportunity for the final 5 survivors to be accepted as direct and unofficial disciples of an Ascension tier immortal, Chen Ping'an didn't believe that for even a single second. On the path of cultivation, it was easy for one to make a spurious correlation between fortune and aptitude. On a surface-level assessment, the more treasures and fated opportunities one obtained, the more they appeared to be cut out for cultivation. However, Chen Ping'an knew that the loftier one's cultivation base, the more stringent their requirements for their prospective disciples, and one had to be the perfect package of aptitude, potential, temperament, and fortune in order to be chosen. With that in mind, it was absurd to think that an ancient Ascension tier cultivator would choose a disciple, particularly a direct disciple, based solely on how many treasures people could gather in a past immortal abode of theirs. This place was rife with peril around every turn. Prior to this, everything had been progressing in a fairly logical and reasonable fashion, with everyone competing against one another for treasures and fated opportunities. Hence, Chen Ping'an wasn't able to arrive at a definitive conclusion on whether this place was a sinister trap or not. However, the immortal abode had just shown its true colors, forcing everyone to turn on each other, and it was clear that whoever was presiding over this place was not some benevolent being. In fact, there was a very good chance that their intentions from the very beginning were to lure everyone in here, then benefit from having all of the treasure hunters kill one another. In light of the abrupt detonation of Taoist Master Sun's treasure pagoda bells from earlier, Chen Ping'an had arrived at the bold conclusion that the one pulling the strings behind the scenes here was very likely a great demon. However, they were unable to do as they pleased due to certain rules and restrictions. For example, the streak of sword chi was most likely a measure put in place to keep the great demon in check. All of a sudden, Chen Ping'an thought of his conversation with Cui Chan on those steps on Downtrodden Mountain. Cui Chan was incredibly certain of the situation that the world was in, and at the time, Chen Ping'an had been tempted to ask him why he hadn't revealed this to some other people or even divulged the information to the entire world at large. However, he didn't raise the question, and he quickly realized the answer to the question for himself. No one would listen, and those who listened wouldn't believe. Chen Ping'an didn't stray too far away from the cluster of buildings that Taoist Master Sun had just looted, and he was beginning to consider using Sword Immortal to tear open the heavens of this small world. This was a decision that was very likely going to decide whether he lived or died. After witnessing the ruse that was staged earlier with the 2 azure deities and the divine maidens in white, Chen Ping'an had come to realize that whoever was presiding over this place was an extremely formidable being indeed. Back in the malicious Ghost Valley, he was only able to successfully escape as he had acted without any warning, thereby managing to catch Gao Cheng a little off guard. But it was very likely that the being that was playing God in this small world was already keeping a very close eye on him. With that in mind, he thought of a compromise. Perhaps he could do what armed sage Cheng Yuanshan had done in the Lotus Flower-blessed land and hide until the 10 days were up. The intentions of the being presiding over this small world would be revealed then, and it would become very clear whether he would have to force his way out of this place using Sword Immortal's power. Huang Shi emerged from around the corner with a puzzled expression as he asked, "Do you really care that much about Taoist Master Sun's survival? Do you really not find his claims about being an official immortal of the lightning god manner suspicious at all? Why don't you take a guess?" Chen Ping'an asked with a smile. Huang Shi pursed his lips for a moment, then asked, "How about you and I join forces to ward off the enemy? You're not worried that I'll weigh you down?" Chen Ping'an asked. Huang Shi was becoming more and more confused, and finally, his curiosity got the better of him as he asked, "What exactly is your cultivation base? Are you actually a Dragon Gate tier cultivator with some skill in the Taslamanic? Or are you a Golden Core tier Earth Immortal? What about you?" Chen Ping'an countered. A candid smile appeared on Huang Shi's face as he revealed, "I'm a decent Vajrabhati tier martial artist. I have a vendetta to settle, so I can't afford to die yet. Alright, then you can regard me as a golden courtier cultivator. A decent one, Chen Ping'an replied in kind. After some contemplation, Huang Shi suggested, what say we leave this mountain to avoid being surrounded? Of course, being surrounded and targeted by everyone would only be the worst-case scenario, but in this situation, I don't think it's a bad idea to prepare for the worst. Why don't you do what Taoist Master Sun did and surrender all your treasures? Chen Ping'an asked. What? You're asking me to put my faith in the notion that all of those official immortals are kind saints? Or are you hoping that all of the vagrant cultivators will have a change of heart and become good people willing to sacrifice themselves to save others? Huang Shi sneered. Chen Ping'an began rubbing his own chin with a contemplative expression, as if he were considering whether to work with Huang Shi or not. Time is of the essence, Huang Shi urged. The more time we waste here, the more danger we'll be in. I'll pass, Chen Ping'an said. I'm worried that you'll punch me again out of the blue. These old bones of mine can't handle much more jostling. You're definitely going to die before me, Huang Shi said with a shake of his head, then took a few steps back and disappeared around the corner. Only then did Chen Ping'an put on another steel-carrying talisman before making his way to a peaceful area and putting on an ordinary scholar's robe. He was looking a little bloated, wearing an additional robe outside of his 3 Dao robes, but given the winter chill in the air, it was arguably a justifiable amount of clothes to be wearing. Chen Ping'an replaced the elderly facade that he was wearing on his face with that of a young man, then adopted Zhu Lian's monkey fist stance, hunching over slightly to make himself appear a little shorter. After that, he removed the 2 cloth bags he had slung over his shoulders before burying them in the ground. As for Sword Immortal and his sword nurturing gourd, he removed them from his body as well before placing them into his pocket treasure. At this moment, Chen Ping'an placed a second pocket treasure on his shopping list in addition to the 2 replica swords of Hatred Sword Mountain that were already on there. After making all these preparations, Chen Ping'an planned to follow the river flowing around the foot of the mountain to return to the front side of the mountain. From there, he would find an opportunity to go and examine the situation at the arched bridge, and he felt in no hurry to go on the run. A tree that towered over the rest was often the first to be cut down, but a tree that blended into the forest around it could often be spared of calamity. This was a principle that he had taught to Gu Qin back in Bamboo Scroll Lake, and he would be wise to follow it himself. All of the decisions that he made from here onward, including whether he was going to be traveling with Taoist Master Sun, would work to serve this principle. Cui Dongshan had once said something very thought-provoking. Understanding the principles on the 2 ends of a line was akin to falling in the middle after a battle between 2 sides. Only then would one be able to glean the truth. Otherwise, principles wouldn't be principles. As soon as one tried to apply such hollow principles to the world around them, they would only do harm and no good. During the journey that the 2 of them had made through the Great Sui Nation, Cui Dongshan had actually said many similarly thought-provoking things, but Chen Ping'an didn't take them to heart at the time, perhaps because these nuggets of wisdom were always delivered in such a joking and lackadaisical fashion. Thinking back, it was the student that had been teaching the teacher all along. A tall and imposing old man was slowly taking a stroll along the boundary of this small world. His ethereal body was destroyed over and over again by a streak of sword chi, only to reform every single time. The streak of sword chi was relentless in its futile endeavor, while the old man simply didn't care. The old man was naturally aware of why the trap that he had set was so brilliant. The situation that he had manufactured presented both the threat of impending doom and the hope of securing a tremendous fated opportunity in the form of an immortal's inheritance. By taking advantage of both the fear and greed inherently present in human nature, it was only inevitable that everyone would begin plotting against one another and turning on each other, and that was naturally precisely what he wanted to see. He thoroughly enjoyed watching everyone's machinations unfold, and witnessing the process of how people hunted down one another, who they chose to target, and how they chose to kill their victims was like sampling a series of incredibly flavorful dishes. Unfortunately for him, there were far too many residual rules in this small world, one of which in particular served as an enormous hindrance to him. Otherwise, he would have most likely been able to refine this entire small world a very long time ago, as opposed to having to constantly sneak around whenever he approached that mountain and the surrounding river. Once he truly became the master of this small world, it would be about time for him to attain his great Tao. Throughout all these years, he had been forced to move from place to place, having to resort to filling his belly with a bunch of lowly ants, but that hadn't entirely been a bad thing. Through observing others, he was able to hone his own Tao heart, and after repeating this process so many times, he had developed more and more insight into what the objective truth was. After this meal, he would have to move again. Otherwise, the nearby sects in the northern complete reed continent could catch on to his trail. He couldn't go to the Middle Earth divine continent as there were too many unfathomable figures there, but the northernmost pure white continent was a decent choice. As for the eastern treasured vile continent in the south, he had overheard from conversations between some cultivators in the outside world that unless he was to go the long way around, he would inevitably have to pass through the territory of the northern mountain, and once the northern mountain god reached the unpolished jade tier, his powers would be equal to those of an immortal tier cultivator, thereby making him rather difficult to deal with. The fact that he was dealing with a mountain god would make it even more difficult for him to completely conceal himself. He couldn't just go to serve as a lowly guest elder for the Great Li Empire. If he had heard about the rise of the Great Li Empire earlier, before the new gods of the eastern treasured vile continent's 5 mountains had been appointed, then it would have been a decent option for him to go and claim one of those spots. Seemingly annoyed by the relentless streak of sword chi, the old man retreated back into the mist, where he sat down with his legs crossed, and there were only some folded paper cranes circling through the air around him. The chamber with the 4 deity murals on the walls that served as the entrance of this small world was actually something left behind by a fallen sect. He had simply recovered it and refined it to be repurposed for his own uses. As it turned out, this wasn't the only renowned mountain that he had refined. Hence, the next time this small world of his emerged, it would be presented in a completely different form. Once a cultivator of a suitably low cultivation base stumbled into the mountain, he would intentionally set up a crude restriction that would fail to attract the interest of Earth immortals. Even if Earth immortals were to venture into the small world, at the very most, they would only be people like Sun Qing, Bai Bai, and Huan Yun, who were serving as Tao guardians. It wasn't that the old man couldn't stomach an Earth immortal or two. He simply wanted to be as safe as possible. Just as Chun Ping'an had suspected, the passages of text on the walls had all been left behind by him, and they were designed to trick those who felt themselves to be smarter than everyone else. The final group of 50 or so people to arrive in the chamber were too stupid, far less intelligent and observant than the first 3 groups of cultivators, so the old man had deactivated all of the restrictions and employed a small trick to lure one person into charging in ahead of everyone else. With that person leading the way, everyone immediately impulsively rushed in after him, completely failing to consider how suspicious it was that the restrictions had suddenly ceased to take effect. Humans were always so predictable. The circling cranes witnessed by the first group of people to enter the immortal abode was also a little trick of his. Cultivators were generally very suspicious and wary of everything, so if he didn't use a few tricks here and there, then everyone would either be too stupid to take his bait, or too much a coward to make a move. Funnily enough, if all of the people who entered this immortal abode were righteous figures of justice who were happy to avoid bloodshed and focus only on securing treasures for themselves, then he would be powerless to do anything aside from close the immortal abode and trap everyone inside until they died of old age. That was what had happened to the 2 people playing Go in that pergola. It wasn't that he couldn't kill people in here, the cost was simply too great. Once he revealed his true body, that streak of sword chi would immediately pounce, and it could even follow the trail and hunt him into the boundless expanse of white mist. There were 2 occasions in which he had almost lost his life to the streak of sword chi during the thousands of years in which he had been lurking in this small world. Furthermore, killing others through brute force was no different from the actions of a naughty child destroying an ant's nest. Back in his hometown, the old man had been no stranger to such activities, and as a result, he had encountered that guest elder from the Taoist temple, reducing him to the pitiful situation that he was in. The many treasures, buildings, and immortal scriptures on the mountain no longer meant much to the old man. Once he reached a sufficient cultivation base that would allow him to ensure self-preservation on any continent of the majestic world, he would establish a sect of his own, at which point all of these treasures and fated opportunities would become part of the wealth of his sect. However, that was only going to happen far in the future, so none of the treasures were useful to him in the immediate future. The treasures that were too lowly in caliber were of no interest to him, and he didn't mind seeing them destroyed and reduced to spiritual energy to nourish this small world. This place was extremely abundant in spiritual energy, particularly water fortune, but that wasn't always the case. At the moment, the old man's attention was focused not on the 3 golden core tier earth immortals, but instead on 3 other people. One of them was too lucky, and that was working against them. Somehow, they had managed to obtain a third of the fated opportunities from the Taoist temple on the mountain summit, including the wooden fragments of the shattered deity statue, and a bunch of glazed roof tiles and floor bricks. As for the other 2, one of them was someone that he was actually tempted to take as his disciple. There really was some affinity between the 2, and if they could become master and disciple, then the latter would surely be able to advance rapidly in their cultivation. From there, they would be able to work with the old man from the outside world to take much of a load off his shoulders. Perhaps he would even be able to devour nascent tier cultivators as he pleased, thereby allowing him to accelerate the attainment of his great Tao, while his disciple would receive the treasures of the earth immortals that were lured into the small world. It would truly be a win-win situation for both parties. The 2 of them would be able to rise to the top of the master, and perhaps one day, he would even be able to return triumphantly back home and give those arrogant old Taoist priests a massive shock. As for the final one, they were the most interesting of the bunch, so they had to die, and the old man most likely wouldn't have to kill them himself. In any case, at the end of the 10 days there would only be 5 people left, so it would be a simple matter to kill a few more. In reality, if those people were able to set aside their differences and work together to break their way out of this small world, the old man would find himself in a bit of trouble, given that he had to contend with that streak of sword chi. He would have to resort to traveling with these people in his stomach until they gradually died of old age in this small world, and their spiritual energy would serve as nourishment for this small world that would serve as their final resting place. However, was that really possible? No. Even if a nascent tier cultivator with hopes of reaching the unpolished jade tier were to emerge from this group, the old man would simply have to kill them himself, albeit at a slight cost. The worst-case scenario would be if someone could secure the approval of that streak of sword chi. In fact, that would be nothing short of a catastrophe for the old man. Thankfully, it didn't appear as if there were anyone in this group that fit the bill. With nothing better to do, the old man opened a book, the pages of which were as thin as cicada wings, and the contents of which had all been inscribed in text so small that it was barely visible at all. The text was also accompanied by images of different cultivators, and it was a chapter book, with each chapter recounting the experiences and demise of a cultivator that had perished in this small world. The accounts were extremely detailed, with each person's words and actions recorded meticulously down to the very last word. But these chapters all varied in length. All of them appeared to be the protagonists of their story, yet all of them ended up dead. Aside from refining all those renowned mountains and great rivers, this was the old man's most important form of cultivation over the years. Even in the midst of the white mist, everything in the small world was visible to the old man in extremely fine detail. This was the pinnacle of observation mystical abilities. At the moment, the sages presiding over small worlds weren't doing so with the pre-existing knowledge developed by the 3 teachings and 100 schools of thought. Instead, they were all learning by themselves. The people that the old man most wanted to visit weren't the sages of the 3 teachings. Instead, he wanted to visit the white paper blessed land of the fictionists. That would surely be a very fruitful visit for both parties that would benefit their great Tao on a mutual basis. The old man raised his head and cast his gaze toward the Taoist temple on the mountain summit with a reminiscent look in his eyes. Many years ago, he had journeyed together with that man. There were very few people in the mountains, but that man had a vast collection of books, and with nothing better to do, the old man read extensively. One time that man asked him how his reading was going, and he replied, "Taoist books are a little cold with death present in life. Buddhist books are a little hot, with joy present in suffering. Confucian books are a little bothersome to read, given all the rules and stipulations." The man smiled and told him that he had understood some of what he had read, but was far from a comprehensive understanding. However, before the old man had a chance to read more books, that catastrophic storm of sword chi descended. Even now, the recollection of that almighty sword strike still sent chills running down the old man's spine. On the verge of death, That man tore open the heavens to send this small world and the old man out of their home world. At that point, his ability to keep the old man in check was already quite lacking, so he could only negotiate with the old man and impose some rules. Countless years had passed since then, and those rules no longer had any binding effects. All that remained to keep the old man in check was that streak of sword chi. As the opportunity seekers of this world entered this place, many were just as reckless and brazen as Huang Shi, smashing the wooden deity statue over and over again. Each time, the old man would reassemble and mend the statue, and during this process, what little veneration that he still harbored toward that man had been slowly whittled away. The old man took a casual glance into the distance. If anyone dared to try and spoil his fun, such as by using brute force to subdue everyone, then they would be the first to die. By killing any dissenters, he would also be making an example out of them so that everyone in the small world would become even more convinced that this was indeed a past place of cultivation for some ancient ascension tier cultivator. Doing so would come at the cost of several dozen years' worth of cultivation base, but for a being like him, time was worth next to nothing. In comparison, honing his Tao heart was much more valuable. Those who had the opportunity to do this didn't do it, while those who didn't possess the wherewithal were arrogant enough to believe that they could take on the task. A prime example was Jian Lai, who had made himself into a complete laughingstock. That one misstep had all but sealed his fate, ensuring that he wasn't going to survive for much longer. In fact, he was most likely going to die in a state of heart-wrenching despair. Perhaps he would perish to one of the vagrant cultivators that he had sought to crush earlier, or perhaps some strings could be pulled to make it so that he perished at the hands of his beloved big sister Bai. At this point, the battle near the arched bridge had already completely subsided, but the mental battle to come was only going to be even more perilous. Huan Yun had surrounded himself with a talisman formation, while Bai Bai was displaying no intention of withdrawing her scattered snow guqin and those 18 good fortune coins. The 6 of them were all communicating with one another through their minds' lakes. Huan Yun, Sun Qing, and Bai Bai were the likeliest to survive to the very end, but all 3 of them had obligations to fulfill. Sun Qing had to look out for Wu Kun and that disciple, while Bai Bai had to protect Jian Qing, and Huan Yun was serving as a Tao guardian of the 2 Cloudtop City disciples. One was striving to protect members of her sect, another her future Tao partner, and for Huan Yun it was a matter of contending with his own conscience. For all 3 of them, this was going to be an extremely stern test of the heart, and even though they were the most formidable figures present in this small world, their situations were no more enviable than that of the others. Huan Yun had considered joining forces with everyone to oppose the strange rules of this small world together, but that was a very risky move that could very easily send him to an early grave, and Sun Qing and Bai Bai were presumably in the same boat. Bai Bai was the first to break the silence, suggesting, "Let's go find those 5 people first." "Then what?" Sun Qing asked with a smile. "At the very least, we have to find that old man at the top of the list," Bai Bai compromised. "Once again, what are we going to do then? You think we can just easily kill someone like that? Will you be leading the charge, or will your almighty young feudal lord-to-be do the honors?" Sun Qing countered. The 2 figureheads of the vagrant cultivators immediately chimed in to support Sun Qing, while Jian Qing could only shake his head with a wry smile. After that earlier battle, all of the vagrant cultivators were eager to see him dead. In contrast, everyone was wary of that black-robed old man, who seemed more like a clown than cultivator. It seemed like no one was going to be hunting him down anytime soon. Huan Yun hesitated momentarily, then suggested, "How about we don't kill people and only take their treasures? Once we take those treasures, no one will claim them. Instead, we'll leave them at the Taoist temple on the mountain summit for now." "And why would we do that?" one of the vagrant cultivator figureheads sneered. "Only 5 of us can survive to the end, so we may as well kill off some people now. Suffering a swift death at our hands will save them the torment of having to dread their impending doom." Another elderly martial artist nodded in agreement as he chimed in, "I think we should also kill off some people, seeing as they'll die eventually anyway. How about each of the 6 of us gets to nominate 4 or 5 people to be spared over the next 5 days? These were the 2 people that had supported Sun Qing earlier. "5 is too many," Jian Qing opposed. "Of course you'd say that," the vagrant cultivator scoffed. Now that one of your servants is dead, you only have 2 left, so of course you think 5 is too many. Ideally, you'd only want each of us to only be able to nominate 1 person to keep alive, isn't that right? Forget I ever said anything then, Jianqing shrugged. I'll take no further part in this conversation. You can feel free to continue. Initially, he had intended to propose that everyone temporarily work together to target the 5 people on the list before working out what to do from there, but that was clearly unfeasible. Given the resentment that he had drawn to himself, any suggestion that he made would most likely have been met with resistance and ridicule. In addition to the 5 people on the list, there were 42 others that were still alive in this small world. Let's all nominate 3 people each then, Bai Bai said. But Jianqing and I get to nominate 2 more people in addition to our 2 servants. Huan Yun didn't say anything. 3 was enough because there were only 3 cultivators from Cloudtop City present. He was only a temporary Dao guardian. Not only was he not the Dao mentor of the 2 young official immortals, he wasn't even a cultivator of Cloudtop City at all. As for the survival of everyone else, he was simply powerless to help them. Sun Qing didn't want to mingle herself with these people, but she didn't say anything. Outside of Wu Kun and her disciple Lu Guibao, she would be able to ensure the survival of a 3rd person, and Lu Guibao had already requested her to save someone just now through her mind's lake. It was a complete stranger, and the only reason Lu Guibao provided for her request was love at first sight. Sun Qing didn't see a problem with that. It had also been a case of love at first sight for her with Lu Jinglong, so what right did she have to admonish her disciple over the same thing? Right at this moment, someone suddenly communicated directly to Sun Qing by condensing their voice into a line, declaring, I know that your residence head son of the Rainbow Sparrow residence. Brother Chu and I don't trust Jianqing's group. So how about we join forces to convince Huan Yun to stand by as a passive observer, while we kill Jianqing and the others? They're the ones who are breaking all the rules, much more so than us vagrant cultivators. Once they're dead, you'll be our leader. Finally, Brother Chu and I will find an opportunity to help the cultivators of your Rainbow Sparrow residence kill Huan Yun and his group. What do you say? At the end, it'll be exactly 5 of us left alive. Sun Qing's brows furrowed tightly at this proposal, and she didn't agree or refuse. The martial artist was in no hurry to hear a response. Given Huan Yun's powers, he would have been the ideal collaborative partner in the eyes of the old martial artist, but unfortunately, Huan Yun was too bound by morals and too wary of ruining his own reputation to make any bold moves. As for Jianqing and Bai Bai, both of them were rotten to the core and nowhere near as trustworthy as Sun Qing. Furthermore, the old martial artist could tell that Sun Qing's 2 companions were also formidable cultivators in their own right. Sure, Bai Bai had already revealed her identity as an official immortal of the Water Dragon sect. But so what? Her status wasn't going to do her any good in this desperate situation. In any case, if she were such a big deal, why didn't she kill everyone and be done with it? At this point, Jianqing had already roughly guessed the situation that he and Bai Bai were in, and he was feeling even more remorseful over his earlier actions. Only now had he truly come to realize that in an isolated place like this small world, concepts like official immortals and vagrant cultivators failed to retain any meaning at all, and it was clear that his actions had implicated Bai Bai as well. However, something that lifted Jianqing's mood slightly was the thought that 18 people were going to die very soon. Not only would his and Bai Bai's party not suffer any further casualties, they would be able to gain 2 additional temporary allies. The more they could whittle down the numbers of the opposing parties, the greater their chances of coming out on top. On the riverbank on the other side of the arched bridge, a young man was sitting on the ground in a despondent daze. His complexion was deathly pale, and he had suffered a glancing blow to the shoulder from Gao Ling earlier. The force of Gao Ling's punch had already torn his brocade robe to shreds, leaving it to drape down limply from his body. An imposing male vagrant cultivator was seated near the young man with his Dao partner, and he scooped up some water from the river to wash his face with, then exhaled before turning to the young man with a smile as he consoled, "It's fine, young Master Huai. There's always a way out, even in the direst of situations, and I think you're a man who's blessed by fortune. We've managed to overcome all of the perils that we've encountered so far, haven't we? If you ask me, you deserve a piece of this tremendous fated opportunity. Just don't forget to toss us some leftovers once you're done." All of the previous scuffles were only against demons of the 4th or 5th tiers, the young man said, and he was rather unfluent in the official language of the Northern Complete Reed continent. Even then, if I weren't traveling with you too, then I certainly wouldn't have dared to engage those things in battle. All I wanted was to travel to a Confucian academy to broaden my horizons, but it seems like I'll never get there. We're going to die, all of us. The woman's brows furrowed slightly in displeasure. In her eyes, the young man was a useless coward who was always in a state of doom and gloom. Prior to this, she was willing to tolerate him as through their past conversations, he had revealed that he had some slight ties with a teacher at the academy, allowing him to enter the academy to borrow and transcribe books. He was only a chi refiner at the pinnacle of the 4th tier, yet he had been completely overcome by adrenaline during the prior battle. First, he was struck by a mystical technique from Zhan Qing, but that wasn't enough to deter him, and he quickly rushed back into the fray once again like a reckless fool. In doing so, he almost charged headfirst into Gao Ling's fist, and if it weren't for the fact that he was swatted aside by a young woman, he would have already suffered a horrific death. It was truly as expected of a scholar. A slender young woman rubbed a hand over her face, and as she approached the group, she spat out several mouthfuls of blood along the way, then sat down beside the young scholar as she said, "From now on, just follow me and don't worry about anything else." The young man turned to her with a dazed expression as he asked, "Are there going to be more battles to come?" "So what if there are?" the young woman asked with a smile. "Are you going to try and save me again, even at the cost of your own life, just like you did on the bridge earlier?" The young man was rather embarrassed. It was yet to be seen who would be saving who. The young woman removed the wine gourd from her waist, then offered it to the young man as she asked, "Care for a drink? It could help you settle your nerves." The young man blushed slightly as he shook his head and refused. "I don't drink." The young woman began drinking out of the gourd herself, and she cast her gaze toward the mountain summit with an amused smile as she said, "If you think it's inappropriate to be drinking out of the same utensil as me, then you can just say so." The young man had no response for this. The young woman was none other than Sun Qing's most prized direct disciple, Lu Guibao. Everyone in the Rainbow Sparrow residence, including Wu Kun, were convinced beyond a shred of doubt that she would become the next residence head. Lu Guibao was still very young. She was a little older than her rather tender appearance suggested, but she was inarguably an exceptional cultivation prodigy, and she had already reached the abode tier. Furthermore, she was the one who had instigated the battle at the arched bridge. Even though Wu Kun was the one who fired the first shot and truly ignited the tensions, the entire setup was thanks to Lu Guibao, and it could even be said that she was the one that Zhan Qing and Bai Bai resented the most. Huai Qian was the foreign scholar who had come to the Northern Complete Reed continent from another continent, and he had gotten swept up in this calamity under rather inexplicable circumstances. In any case, Lu Guibao was very fond of him, particularly the way that he tried to pretend to be an experienced and knowledgeable cultivator that was wise beyond his years. It was adorably foolish and naive. Perhaps it was because Lu Guibao was too shrewd and intelligent from a young age, but she had quickly grown fond of this young scholar who was a polar opposite to herself. Just as her mistress said, if one had to think of many reasons for why they like someone, then they didn't truly like that person, and they should hurry up and like someone else. Whenever Sun Qing became inebriated after a few drinks, she would always tell this prized disciple of hers about Lu Jinglong. In the process, she would unconsciously put out colloquial nuggets of wisdom like this from time to time, and that was very adorable in Lu Guibao's eyes as well. Meanwhile, the discussion between the 6 people on the other side of the bridge continued. They had agreed on who to kill, and now it was time to decide how those people would be killed and by who. Some of the smarter ones here could most likely already sense the impending peril. Lu Guibao turned to look at everyone, and it seemed that there weren't many smart ones among them. Meanwhile, a man was sitting on his own on the riverbank, feeling absolutely petrified. He was making sure to keep his distance from everyone else. He was all on his own, and he could already count himself extremely fortunate not to have perished in the earlier battle. The man was wearing a pair of extremely well-worn boots that would have been a familiar sight to Chan Ping'an. Right at this moment, someone yelled through their mind's lake that the 6 people had been convinced by Zhan Qing to kill all of the vagrant cultivators in the small world first. No one knew if this was true, but no one dared to not believe it. Hence, after a brief moment of stunned inactivity, everyone began retreating away from the arched bridge as quickly as they could. Whoever had made this false declaration clearly didn't possess the same secret technique as Lu Guibao, and they had also underestimated just how sharp the senses of the 6 people on the other side of the bridge were. As a result, he was immediately spotted. Furthermore, he had chosen not to flee right away, as doing so would have made him appear too conspicuous, and he only turned to flee once most of the others had already dispersed. However, by then it was already too late. Gao Ling kicked up a sharp blade with his foot, then grabbed it by the hilt before hurling it through the air. The blade pierced straight through the man's head, killing him in an instant. Zhang Qing wanted to stop him, but was unable to do so in a timely fashion. This was a very crude method of drawing even more enmity to Zhang Qing, but the truth hardly mattered anyway. Initially, he had entered this place with full confidence, treating it as almost a sightseeing trip in which he would do some treasure hunting on the side. But since then, the situation had completely spiraled out of control, and at this point, he was already feeling a little numb to it all. A hint of dejection appeared on Wu Kun's face, but she hid it very well. The man that had just been killed was the leader of a small sect, an elderly cultivator who had ventured into this immortal abode in the hopes of extending his own life. The old man knew that his fate was already sealed, so he had made a deal with Wu Kun, one that she would be sure to follow through on. From here onward, the Rainbow Sparrow residents would provide financial support to his sect in secret, and she had also promised to nurture at least 3 cultivators of the middle 5 tiers for his sect over the next century, one of which had to be his final disciple. The old man had earned this compensation at the cost of his own life. Aside from Sun Qing and Wu Kun, the other 4 people on the other side of the arched bridge were all feeling quite perplexed. Had someone secretly put the old man up to this, or had he gone insane? Alternatively, could it be that he had some type of vendetta against the feudal lord's manor of the Northern Pavilion nation and wanted to make Zhang Qing suffer, even at the cost of his own life? Of course, the answer hardly mattered, but the problem was that his words had caused everyone to flee in different directions, so the 6 of them would be forced to split up and hunt them down. Gao Ling was definitely going to be the one most eager to take on the task. He had been furious this entire time, and he was looking for an outlet to vent. Even though he had suffered some rather severe injuries, a resilient physical constitution was a common trait among all martial artists, and he could still hunt down small groups of vagrant cultivators just fine. However, people like Lu Guibao and Huai Qian didn't get away, and Wu Kun began treating her own injuries once she joined them. There were 2 more groups of people who were clearly very uneasy, but also didn't go anywhere. They were the entourages of the Dragon Gate tier vagrant cultivator, and the martial arts master on the other side of the river. Among the people fleeing for their lives was a vagrant cultivator, who was praying to the heavens that he could grow an additional pair of legs to grant him extra speed. He was gradually distancing himself from everyone else because he trusted no one, and it seemed to him like anyone else could kill him. Earlier, he had used the expensive lightning talisman that he had purchased for 8 snowflake coins during the battle at the bridge, and it really had saved his life. However, after using up the talisman, he truly had no trump cards left up his sleeve. All of a sudden, he heard a somewhat familiar voice ring out from behind him. "You were at the Cloudtop City Market, right?" The man continued to race along as he turned his head with an alarmed expression, only to discover that a stranger had appeared beside him, and he asked in a tentative manner, "You're the guy that was selling the talismans?" The stranger smiled and nodded in response, and the man almost burst into tears. Finally, he had found an ally for himself. He slowed down slightly as he asked in a cautious manner, "You're not going to kill me, are you?" In his panicked state of mind, he had failed to consider how strange it was that the traveling salesman from back in the Cloudtop City Market had somehow managed to appear beside him without any warning, as if he had materialized out of thin air. Furthermore, his appearance had also changed, but the man merely attributed that to a good disguise. Chan Ping'an shook his head as he asked, "Would I be able to earn money by killing you? Even if I could, would I be able to outcompete all of those powerful cultivators?" The man heaved a sigh of relief and didn't speak any further. From there, the 2 of them began to focus wholeheartedly on making an escape. All of a sudden, someone up ahead spotted the boundless expanse of white mist, and a look of shock and alarm appeared on their face as they exclaimed, "Is this already the end?" The misty boundary of the immortal abode quickly receded like the falling tide, gradually revealing the landscape that had originally been concealed, and the immortal abode rapidly expanded. Huan Yun had no intention of killing anyone, and he quickly departed from the arched bridge, making his way up the mountain to search for Shanzhan's 2 disciples. Sun Qing also didn't intend to get her hands dirty for now, and she instructed Wu Kun's trio to take a look in the south. Bai Bai and Zhan Qing had instructed Gao Ling to kill as he pleased, while the imperial guest elder of the Sacred Lotus Nation had been called to Bai Bai's side. Gao Ling took off his suit of dew armor, reverting it back to an armor pellet before tucking it up his sleeve, then picked up the saber of an already deceased martial artist before racing away. Within the white mist, the tall and imposing old man had already put away the book in his hands, and he began to slide back through the air, ensuring that he remained concealed even as the white mist retreated. His hands were clasped behind his back, and a smile had appeared on his face as he mused. If the territory is too small, you'll all end up dead before too long, and that would deprive me of a good show. After 5 days, he had several more very interesting new rules to announce to everyone. For example, the one who killed the most people would be accepted as the second direct disciple among the final 5. Huan Yun and Sun Qing were clearly unwilling to get their hands dirty for now. But would they be able to hold back once that rule was announced? The old man turned to cast his gaze toward a young man in the distance, who had already dug a hole on the boundary and buried himself inside, then mused to himself, "It'll also be interesting to see whether you possess the fortune and wherewithal to become my first ever disciple." Feng had already buried himself on the original boundary, only to discover that the boundary had suddenly begun to expand. He cursed under his breath as he tore his way out of the soil, and he didn't even take a moment to dust himself off before racing deeper into the mountains. Shortly thereafter, Huang Shi suddenly stopped in his tracks, then veered off his original course and arrived by the hole that Feng had just dug himself out of. He crouched down beside the hole to pick up some soil, then raised his head and smiled as he cast his gaze toward the tiny figure racing away in the distance. Killing Chen Pingyan was perhaps going to be a rather risky endeavor, but killing Feng certainly wasn't going to be a difficult task. Meanwhile, the 5 people at the foot of the mountain had agreed to scale the mountain together and reconvene at the summit, at which point they would set off in search of the other 4 people outside of the 2 cloud-top city cultivators. They would find them first, then decide whether to kill them or not thereafter. Deep in the mountains, Chen Pingyan was fleeing for his life with his new companion Jin Shan. Elsewhere, Gao Ling was on an unstoppable rampage, and anyone that wasn't fast enough to get away from him was split into 2 by a single swing of his saber. Wu Kun and Lu Guibao were traveling together, and they were doing so at a rather leisurely pace in order to cater to Huai Qian's lackluster speed. Meanwhile, the 2 groups of people under the Dragon Gate tier vagrant cultivator and the martial arts master had joined forces to hunt down the fleeing stragglers, taking to the task with much zeal and vigor. Huan Yun was able to track down the 2 cloud-top city disciples, who had already accepted their fates, and he told them that there was no need for them to fear for their lives, and that they could choose to remain here or continue searching for treasures. After that, Huan Yun noticed the Dragon Gate tier guest elder, who had concealed himself, but he pretended not to have noticed and continued scaling the mountain. On the White Jade Plaza on the mountain summit, Bai Bai couldn't help but be stunned by the sight of the glazed green tiles and bricks strewn among the wreckage of the destroyed Taoist temple. However, a wry smile then appeared on her face as she didn't dare to take anything from this vast mountain of riches. In the end, she only picked up a brick from the ground and began absorbing the water fortune spiritual energy inside to replenish her depleted spiritual energy reserves. With Huan Yun leading the way, the 6 of them quickly tracked down Taoist Master Sun, who immediately surrendered himself over to them without a fight. The 3 of them were split evenly in a 3-to-3 vote on whether Taoist Master Sun should be spared. All the while, Taoist Master Sun remained seated on the ground in a slumped and defeated fashion, having already accepted his fate. In the end, the old martial artist was the one to come up with a way to break the 3-on-3 stalemate, proposing that they flip a coin to decide Taoist Master Sun's fate. At the same time, he was communicating to the other 5 people in secret, declaring that he would kill Taoist Master Sun on the spot if the latter dared to try and use spiritual energy to manipulate the outcome of the coin flip. As it turned out, Taoist Master Sun's luck was still as brilliant as ever. Not only did he not try to play any tricks, the coin ultimately landed on the side that granted his survival. Thus, the group of 6 told him to carry his 2 bags to the Taoist temple on the mountain summit, after which he was free to go anywhere that he pleased. Taoist Master Sun was in a complete daze, so stunned by this outcome that he had forgotten to even celebrate. If that old man is still at the top of the list after 5 days, then we have to find him and kill him. Bai said to the others through her mind's lake, and this time, not even Huan Yun or Sun Qing raised any objections. Following the departure of the group of 6, Taoist Master Sun began scaling the mountain with his 2 bags on his back, wiping away tears as he did so. While passing by the green bamboo tree, he began missing Qian Ping'an. As for Qian Ping'an himself, he had leaped onto a tall branch after verifying that there was no one around, and he began scouring his surroundings from his vantage point. Jin Shan didn't dare to get up there for fear of taking a long-range attack out of the blue. Qian Ping'an turned to him and said, "This is as far as I can take you. Staying with me is only going to put you in an early grave. Make sure to use those 2 concealment talismans well. Just plaster one onto your body and go somewhere you feel is safe and quiet. Then stay put somewhere and try to move around as little as possible." Before Jin Shan had a chance to say anything, Qian Ping'an had already vanished from the spot. A panicked look appeared on Jin Shan's face, but in the wake of Qian Ping'an's departure, 5 talismans had come drifting down from above, consisting of 1 each of the 3 types of offensive talismans and 2 other talismans that Jin Shan didn't recognize. Jin Shan gripped the 5 talismans tightly in his hands as he erupted into tears, but he only allowed himself a brief outpouring of emotions before continuing his journey. Qian Ping'an found a mountain summit with a wide and open view in the distance, then plastered a steel-carrying talisman to himself and remained completely still as he inspected his surroundings. This had truly been a very eventful treasure-hunting trip, to say the least. There were quite a few familiar faces including Jin Shan, Huan Yun and Wu Kun. He had a decent impression of both Huan Yun and Wu Kun, but it was difficult to say whether his impression of them would remain positive from here onward. Regardless of their status, reputation or cultivation base, it was only to be expected that they would turn on the other treasure hunters in the immortal abode given the situation that they were in. Even those who were killed by them would perhaps be full of resentment and indignation, but they would hardly be surprised. Qian Ping'an began staring off into the distance in a daze. Why was it that the integrity of humanity was so fragile and quick to waver? What truly made Qian Ping'an uncomfortable wasn't how fragile humanity was in others. Instead, it was the fragile nature of his own humanity. The fact that he was having these thoughts meant that he was also grappling with the same inner conflict. Ever since he arrived on the northern complete reed continent, he had been constantly cultivating, focusing particularly on the cultivation of the heart, trying to become a true cultivator. All of a sudden, he thought of something that he had read in a Taoist scripture, something that a militarian sage had later remarked on in a book of their own, providing their unique insights on the subject. Both of those quotes had been engraved onto bamboo slips by Qian Ping'an. The latter of those quotes was, "All those in the same boat are enemies." It served as a cautionary reminder to the rulers of mortal empires that they had to serve with prudence and morality, and that no physical barriers could truly ward off the enemy. As for the phrase from the Taoist scripture, it was one that had more significant implications, and Qian Ping'an felt like it applied perfectly to the situation that he was currently in. One can hide their moat in a ravine, thinking it to be safe, only for it to be taken in the night, with the owner none the wiser. This perilous small world appeared to have been vastly different from the majestic world, which was protected by various rules, but Qian Ping'an couldn't help but wonder if the two were actually fundamentally the same. The boat had already been moved from the ravine, but no one was aware. All of a sudden, Qian Ping'an was beginning to understand just how difficult it was to achieve the state of tranquility that Taoists pursued. It was like being suspended in a void of nothingness, with no one else around you, nor any rules to bind you or karma to ensnare you. Qian Ping'an heaved a faint sigh. When it came to certain paths, only once they were taken would one come to discover just how lonely and confounding a pursuit it was. Qian Ping'an began practicing his breathing techniques as he waited silently. If he were discovered, then the perpetrator would definitely be the old talisman master that had purchased all those talismans from him back in Cloudtop City. 5 days later, 18 people had perished, and by some miracle Jian Shan wasn't on that list. The divine maiden in white reappeared with the two azure-robed deities to display the screen of water, and immediately brought about another sharp spike in the number of casualties. With the latest update to the rules stating that the one among the final 5 survivors who had killed the most people would be made into the second direct disciple, the Dragon Gate tier vagrant cultivator and the martial arts master had turned on their own entourages without any hesitation, even though many of them were family and friends. They were doomed to perish here anyway, so as opposed to having them perish later at the hands of others, the two men decided that it was better for them to die in this fashion. Lu Guibao observed this scene with a look of frosty disdain, while Huai Qian heaved a distraught sigh. Why must they all be so cruel and violent? Sure enough, just as the young male cultivator from Cloudtop City anticipated, the Dragon Gate tier elder reappeared before them right as the first 5 days were about to pass. He knocked the woman unconscious, then used a mystical technique to immobilize the young man, rendering him unable to move or speak. After that, he placed the jade brush pocket treasure into the young man's grasp before swiftly departing and concealing himself nearby. As for all of the other treasures that he had obtained thus far, those had been temporarily hidden. However, that wasn't what caused the young man the most despair. What truly made his heart sink was the fact that Huan Yun didn't make an appearance at all to save them. It was very likely that he wasn't far away, but had chosen to serve as a passive observer. Hence, the young man was still ranked second on the list, while the bottom-ranked figure on the list was Huan Yun. At this point, it no longer mattered whether he stayed off the list or not. The 4th treasure hunter on the list was a white-robed young man with a bright smile on his face. However, his robes were stained with blood, and he seemed to have been situated in an elegant study. Hanging on the wall in the study was a pail fashioned from half a gourd, and it was displaying a yellow complexion from as his visage was displayed on the screen of water. He waved to everyone with a smile and said, "Have a smooth trip to the afterlife, everyone." He then turned to another direction and called out, "Are you going to keep serving as a door god for me outside, Huang Shi? How kind of you. May you live a long and prosperous life." The 3rd-ranked figure on the list was none other than Huang Shi, who had concealed himself in a ditch deep in the mountains. He was seated at the bottom of the ditch with his legs crossed, and there was a layer of branches, twigs, and grass over his head, concealed under a layer of soil, but the image of him on the screen of water was as bright as day. Huang Shi took a glance at the screen of water, then raised his middle finger to everyone. Immediately thereafter, he abruptly rose to his feet and jumped out of the ditch. Outside was what appeared to have been the entrance of an abode, but it was concealed behind a layer of rainbow cloud and mist. As it turned out, Huang Shi had pursued Di Yuanfeng all the way to this place, but not only was the latter able to survive, he had fled into the abode, while Huang Shi was unable to break through the restrictions at the entrance. Hence, he decided to bury himself outside to try and ambush Di Yuanfeng once the latter came out, and he wasn't surprised that Di Yuanfeng had predicted his plan. The person at the top of the list was still the same black-robed old man. He seemed to have been hiding in a cave that should have been very dimly lit, if not submerged in complete darkness, but just like with Huang Shi, his visage was as bright and clear as day. He still had the same 2 cloth bags slung across his shoulders and was carrying the same sword on his back, and as he turned to the screen of water, an infuriated look appeared on his face as he yelled, "I'm telling you all, there has to be a mistake. I'll kill any of you that dares to come after me. You don't want to mess with me. My sword is peerlessly sharp, and when I go all out, even I'm afraid of my own power." Taoist Master Sun was staying near the ruins of the Taoist temple on the mountain summit, having already resigned himself to waiting for the embrace of death, and he heaved a faint sigh upon seeing this. Over these past few days, he had been staying on the mountain summit the entire time in a state of constant unease, with the exception of a trip that he made down the backside of the mountain, but that proved to be a completely unfruitful trip. Over the past 5 days, other people had also been progressively carrying treasures up to the mountain summit, and at this point, a small mountain of treasures had already taken shape outside of the ruins of the Taoist temple. Taoist Master Sun could hardly even be bothered to look at the mountain of treasures anymore. Taoist Master Sun shook the porcelain vial that he had used to collect those water droplets from the bamboo tree. He had been very conservative in his drinking, so there was still some left. Earlier, he had mustered up some courage and made his way back to the bamboo tree, only to discover that not even a single drop of water remained. Taoist Master Sun couldn't help but be impressed with Qian Ping'an. He was like a walking swarm of locusts, leaving nothing in his wake. It would be a real pity if someone so cut out to be a vagrant cultivator were to become an official immortal. Lu Guibao was standing together with Huai Qian next to the stone railing on the edge of the mountain summit. This was already the second time that Huai Qian had noticed the black-robed old man, and he murmured to himself, "Looks like he's got some tricks up his sleeve." "What's that supposed to mean?" Lu Guibao asked in a puzzled manner. "It means exactly what it sounds like," Huai Qian replied with a smile. Lu Guibao faltered slightly at this response, then asked, "Are you hiding something from me, Huai Qian?" "I am," Huai Qian admitted in a tentative manner. "Back home, the seniors of my clan already arranged a marriage for me, and I've come here this time to escape from that marriage." "What's your marriage partner like?" Lu Guibao asked with a smile. "I only ever met her once, so I barely even remember her," Huai Qian sighed. "All I can recall is that she had a decent personality. However, she was a martial artist, and she went to even more extreme measures than I have, fleeing to the Golden Armor continent to avoid having to marry me." Lu Guibao merely nodded and spoke no further on the matter. Huai Qian was a little anxious, and his gaze was drifting back and forth in an uncertain fashion as he said, "Can I tell you something else, Ms. Lu? I know what you want to say. You like me, right? What are you looking so uneasy for?" "I like you too." Lu Guibao chuckled. Huai Qian had no response for this. After that largely trivial conversation, Lu Guibao began to consider what she was going to do next. Sometimes brains were more useful than brawn, and in her eyes Zhan Qing possessed neither. While Lu Guibao was deep in thought, Huai Qian took a glance at her from the side, then smiled as he leaned against the railing and cast his gaze into the distance. What he had actually wanted to tell her was that the two of them weren't meant to be. There was simply too much of a disparity between the two of them in all facets, and the only reason why they were even able to hold a conversation with each other at all was because he was catering to her. There was a vast disparity between them in terms of cultivation base, intentions, and background, and with that in mind, he had taken pity on this foolish girl. Among all those who had entered this immortal abode, he was most likely the one most aware of the magnitude of the fated opportunity that this place presented, and he had come here with the sole purpose of pursuing that streak of sword chi. He was only putting on this act and pretending to be a frail scholar for his own entertainment. Having said that, this streak of sword chi had truly been a pleasant surprise. Originally, his plan was to make a trip to the north to meet with sword immortal Bai Shang before returning to his hometown. Barring any extraordinary circumstances, he anticipated that Bai Shang would come out to personally greet him. The thought of his hometown was one that filled him with a sense of distaste and monotony. He had been watching these ants being manipulated like puppets on strings for the past 5 days, and it was becoming a rather wearisome sight. As for the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, they couldn't have been all that powerful if they were being kept in check by a streak of sword chi. Even if he didn't bring up his background, he would be able to negotiate with the one presiding over this immortal abode. He would obtain the streak of sword chi, while the latter would be freed, and it would be a win-win situation for both. He took a glance at the foolish girl who was still thinking about a bunch of completely pointless things, and he smiled as he asked, "How about I spare you the wait and make you the head of the Rainbow Sparrow residence today, Ms. Lu?" Lu Guibao instantly sprang back through the air as she yelled with an alarmed expression. "Who are you?" Huai Qian raised a finger to his lips to make a quieting gesture, then said to her through her mind's lake, "Prior to coming to the northern complete reed continent, our ancestor warned me that the sword immortals here are very unreasonable people who take pride in killing the prodigies of other continents, so I have to constantly be on my guard and keep a low profile." Lu Guibao's expression remained unchanged, but her mind was racing, and she discovered that she was unable to communicate with Sun Qing through her mind's lake. "Don't try any funny business, Ms. Lu. If you keep this up, then we can't even be friends anymore," Huai Qian sighed. He then cast his gaze into the heavens and mused, "I don't want to waste any more time here. These childish manipulation tactics are making me a little sick. I have to educate the so-called god of this world and old spiritual master Huan what a true talisman master looks like." Immediately thereafter, an object appeared in each of his hands, and one of them was a golden militarian armor pellet, a suit of incense fire deity armor of the highest caliber. Even among incense fire deity armor, this was one of the oldest suits in existence. Clad in the suit of armor, Huaiqian was also holding 2 azure talismans in his other hand, and he casually tossed out one of them with a smile as he chanted an incantation. With an iron tablet sent to the underworld, I call upon the lightning god to descend. A deity that was clad in a suit of golden armor and standing at over 20 feet tall appeared out of thin air, its entire body flashing with blinding white lightning. As soon as its feet touched the ground, the entire mountain shuddered, as did the mountain and water fortune in the entire immortal abode. After the second talisman was tossed out, a man dressed in a flowing white robe with a sword on his back appeared. He had a rather stiff and wooden expression on his face, but there was formidable sword chi emanating from his body, eradicating all of the spiritual energy around him. Finally, Huaiqian raised up a small, golden openwork ball that was sitting on the palm of his hand. Inside the ball, streaks of sword light could be seen racing back and forth, clashing against the interior of the ball to raise flurries of sparks. Huaiqian had come to the northern complete reed continent in order to advance the cultivation base of this puppet servant of his. At the moment, the puppet was on the cusp of the nascent tier, and he was hoping that it would be able to overcome its bottleneck once it devoured a few bonded flying swords of golden core tier swordsmen, and drew upon the sword Dao fortune of the northern complete reed continent. Huaiqian gently tossed the golden ball at the white-robed swordsman, and it immediately vanished into one of the puppet's acupoints. The streak of sword chi that had been patrolling this small world for countless years abruptly drew to a halt, as if it were observing Huaiqian from above. "I knew you would choose me," Huaiqian said with a smile, then cast his gaze toward the heavens in a certain direction as he mused. "I've never sensed this type of demon energy before, and I don't know of any demons fond of refining mountains for food either. Does something like this even exist in our majestic world?" Deathly silence ensued. Everyone was completely flabbergasted by what they were witnessing. "How about this? If we engage in a battle and I am unable to kill you, nor are you able to kill me, then you have to come with me to the Middle-earth Divine Continent. I guarantee you a bright future ahead," Huaiqian proposed. The sea of clouds descended slightly, and a tall and imposing man appeared, sitting on its edge as he chuckled. "You sure talk big for someone so young." With a sweep of his sleeve, an all-encompassing scroll was unfurled, depicting a piece of scenery, and anyone could see it from anywhere in the small world as long as they raised their heads. Huaiqian had made a display of sincerity, and the old man felt like he had to reciprocate. Huaiqian smiled as he shrugged. "I can't help it when my ancestor is one of top 10 cultivators of the Middle-earth Divine Continent." As it turned out, a junior heavenly master of Mount Longhu and Lu Yuzhou of the Pure White Continent were both very good friends of his. The old man sitting atop the sea of clouds fell silent, while Huaiqian continued with a look of undisguised disdain on his face. "If I'm going to be unpleasantly frank here, even if I stuck out my neck and allowed you to kill me, would you dare?" The old man remained silent. Huaiqian looked around as he asked, "Are you going to kill these useless pieces of trash? Or am I going to have to do it? If you're going to do it, then I'll have to ask you to spare a few that I intend to take with me." Just like everyone else, Chun Ping'an was also stunned by this turn of events. Earlier, he had immediately disguised himself as a young man as soon as the screens of water had disappeared, and this was truly an eye-opening experience for him. While he was impressed with the young man's audacity, he didn't aspire to become someone like that at all. If someone like that young man had experienced the same things that he had, then even if their cultivation base had been superior to his, they would have already died countless times over. However, that was hardly a fair assessment to make. The fact that he was able to stand there and make such a bold declaration was an indication that he had certain positive traits and advantages over others. Chun Ping'an was currently only seeing one facet of the young man, and it was unfair to judge his character solely based on that. If Chun Ping'an were in his place, then he would have also definitely failed to reach the young man's current heights. However, in Chun Ping'an's eyes, the young man was far too lacking in tolerance and shrewdness. If his luck were to take a turn for the worse, then there really was a chance that he would lose his life on the northern complete reed continent. He could only thank his lucky stars that he hadn't encountered anyone like Sword Immortal Jiyu thus far. However, his decision to tear off his own facade and reveal his true power had clearly been made after weighing up his options, and at the moment it appeared that not only was he going to leave this place alive, he would also be able to take the old man back to the Middle-earth divine continent with him. It was undeniable that he was a very impressive young man, as expected of someone who had come to the northern complete reed continent from the Middle-earth divine continent with the sole purpose of killing swordsmen. Chen Ping'an wasn't so spiteful that he would actively root against someone like this. Everyone had their own path, and just because someone walked a path different from your own wasn't a just cause for spite and resentment. It was just like how Chen Ping'an was pursuing the same path of martial arts as Cao Ci, but he felt no resentment toward the latter just because he was always lagging far behind. What was he supposed to do? Make a voodoo doll of Cao Ci and pray for his downfall? Chen Ping'an rubbed his own chin in a thoughtful manner. He felt like he shouldn't have been thinking about this type of nonsense in this situation, but it was rather amusing. Thinking back to the 3 battles that he had fought against Cao Ci on the Sword Qi Great Wall, Chen Ping'an did feel a little indignant, but not because he had been defeated in all 3 battles. After all, Cao Ci had beaten him fair and square, and he had no complaints in that regard. What he did feel indignant about was how much of an infuriating bastard Cao Ci was. Not only was he absurdly handsome, he always seemed so tranquil and nonchalant, constantly looking past everyone, as if the only thing in his line of sight was the legendary summit of the martial Tao. The fact that he couldn't beat Cao Ci in a fight only made Chen Ping'an even more frustrated, but there was nothing that he could do. However, it was only what happened next that truly had Chen Ping'an's skin crawling. In the wake of this stunning revelation, Taoist Master Sun had fallen onto his backside in shock, but all of a sudden, he rose to his feet, only to fall back down to the ground in a limp and lifeless state. However, out of the lifeless body emerged an ethereal Taoist Master Sun, as if his own soul had drifted out of his body. Taoist Master Sun reached out with one hand, easily grabbing onto the streak of sword qi that was struggling to get away. The old man on the Sea of Clouds didn't know what had happened to Taoist Master Sun, but he knew that something had gone terribly wrong, and he immediately turned and tried to flee back into the protection of the Sea of Clouds. To think that a lowly little demon like you would dare to try and refine this mountain and claim this Taoist temple, Taoist Master Sun mused expressionlessly. He then took a glance at the ruins of the Taoist temple, and a hint of sorrow appeared in his eyes. He cast his gaze into the distance, somewhere within the Sea of Clouds, then harumphed coldly. You thought you'd have nothing to worry about in this majestic world? You thought I wouldn't be able to do anything to you just because my branch is far from its heyday. Taoist Master Sun closed his hand into a fist, and the streak of sword qi was crushed within his grasp. He then joined his middle and index fingers before gently swiping them forward, and the Sea of Clouds was parted down the center, while a tiny figure the size of a mustard seed was also sliced into 2. Huai Qian was just about to say something when Taoist Master Sun turned to him and sneered. Who do you think you are? Did your seniors not teach you about the importance of humility? Are you not worried that you could sprain your tongue with those cocky words? If there really is a bonded lamp for you in your clan's ancestral hall, then your ancestor can come to the majestic world and seek me out for vengeance. Huai Qian opened his mouth to speak again, intending to declare the name of his ancestor, but he was killed on the spot by another swipe of Taoist Master Sun's joined fingers. Even his nascent tier swordsman puppet was destroyed, drifting back down to the ground as 2 halves of a severed talisman. Finally, Taoist Master Sun turned his gaze to the ruins of the Taoist temple. That temple had been erected to worship his junior brother, who was once a central figure of the heavenly world sword immortal branch, just like him. Unfortunately, it seemed that even the heavens envied his junior brother for his extraordinary talents, and he met his demise at a very young age. The White Jade capital was not to blame. He could only blame himself for being so indecisive, to the point that even his senior brother wasn't able to avenge him. There were countless ways to die in this world, but the only ones who couldn't be saved were those who sought out death for themselves. On the mountain summit in the distance, Chen Ping'an had already pulled out all of the fragments of the wooden deity statue. You really are an alert lad, Taoist Master Sun chuckled. I look away for 1 second, and you've already saved yourself. He reached out to make a grabbing motion, and Di Yuanfeng, Zhan Qing, and Lu Guibao were all plucked out thin air to appear before him. Are the 3 of you willing to follow me to the heavenly world? He asked in an indifferent manner. He had accumulated enough merit throughout his travels in this world to be able to take 3 people with him. While waiting for the answers from the trio, the flow of time seemed to have fallen completely still. Taoist Master Sun stroked his beard with a smile as he cast his gaze toward Qian Ping'an and said, "In light of those 3 sticks of incense that you offered up earlier, you can keep those fragments." "It was actually 6 sticks of incense, Taoist Master Sun," Qian Ping'an corrected. Taoist Master Sun burst into laughter, and he swept a sleeve through the air, seemingly to collect something, only to scatter it again. "You can have this then. It'll be enough to feed that sword of yours." On the mountain summit several hundred kilometers away, a ball of broken sword qi appeared before Qian Ping'an. As the flow time became stagnant, everything fell completely still. Huang Shi was hiding deep in the mountains, having dug out a small cave for himself under the cover of an ancient pine tree on a sheer cliff face. The cave was only just large enough to fit him and his huge bag. At this moment, he was immobilized in the stagnant river of time, and his entire body was drenched in sweat. Out of their 4-man treasure hunting party, he had always thought that he could kill the other 3 with ease, but now, he was left thanking his lucky stars that he never made an attempt on Taoist Master Sun's life. Jin Shan was hiding in a patch of reeds beside a lake with a steel-carrying talisman plastered to his body, and there was a dazed look on his face. Shun Zhenz's 2 direct disciples were holding hands so tightly that the veins on the backs of their hands were bulging, clearly indicating their tension and unease. Not far away from them was the Dragon Gate tier guest Elder Su, who was looking both livid and lost. On the mountain summit, Huan Yun's eyes were closed with an exhausted look on his face, and it was unclear what he was thinking. Gao Ling was clad in his suit of dew armor with his fists tightly clenched and a pained look on his face. Wu Kun had a dumbstruck look in her eyes and a hand clasped over her own chest, seemingly in a complete flabbergasted daze at all these stunning revelations. Following Huaiqian's demise, the golden deity and the nascent tear puppet that had attempted to protect him from Taoist Master Sun's killing blow had been reduced to a pair of torn talismans. The openwork golden ball that contained all those bonded flying swords had fallen to the ground, and it was currently resting against the railing. The burst of sword qi unleashed by Taoist Master Sun had been so devastating that Huaiqian's soul, golden core, and nascent soul had been instantly destroyed, and even the 2 priceless minimization treasures in his possession had been decimated. Everything that they contained was naturally also destroyed, reduced to spiritual energy to fuse with this small world. Even though the river of time had fallen stagnant, some iridescent ripples could occasionally be seen. They were like small stones cast into a river, producing small splashes that were insignificant, but still noticeable. Meanwhile, the green glazed roof tiles of the ruined Taoist temple on the mountain summit were giving off a special glow of their own, as if they were contending against the stagnant river of time. Qian Ping'an was already accustomed to this type of environment. In fact, it was an opportunity that he relished as it could hone his physical constitution as a martial artist. Back in the 300-year river of time in the lotus flower-blessed land, he had even once witnessed the old abbot of the observing Tao temple occasionally plucking out golden fragments the size of grains of rice. However, he didn't dare to accept the ball of sword qi. "Are you scared?" Taoist Master Sun asked with an amused smile. "A little," Qian Ping'an admitted with a nod. "You deserve it," Taoist Master Sun reassured. "It doesn't matter what the Taoist Master Sun that you knew thinks of it. All those under the heavens who do not go seeking death do not deserve to die. At the very least, that's what I believe. As for those who go out courting death, then they can only blame themselves for not having strong enough backers to rely on." Taoist Master Sun took a glance at Huaiqian's body as he spoke. Could the top 10 cultivators of the Middle-earth Divine Continent compare with the top 10 cultivators of the entire heavenly world? Even if he were to go to Huaiqian's clan to personally apologize for the latter's death, Huaiqian's ancestor wouldn't even dare to accept the apology. Having said that, Taoist Master Sun had left his Tao sword and his true body back in that Taoist temple in the majestic world, and he was also bound by the rules of Confucianism in the majestic world, so he was far from the peak of his powers. Only then did Qian Ping'an pull out his sword nurturing gourd before carefully guiding the ball of incredibly potent sword qi inside. And the gourd instantly became extremely heavy. "A gift from a senior must not be refused," Qian Ping'an said with a smile. Taoist Master Sun offered no response as he turned his gaze back to the trio assembled before him, and all of a sudden, the three of them returned to their senses. They were immediately struck by a sense of discomfort in the stagnant river of time, and in particular Jianqing felt as if all of his internal organs had been stirred up into a broken mess. It was only by gritting his teeth and holding on with all his might that he was able to remain on his feet at all. Not only that, but Taoist Master Sun had returned Sun Qing and Bai Bai to their senses as well. "I'm planning to take the three of you as unofficial disciples of mine," Taoist Master Sun declared. "However, I won't force any of you to do anything against your will, so the choice is ultimately up to you. You will only have this one opportunity. Listen to your heart and tell me your." Jianqing didn't hesitate at all to fall to his knees and kowtow to Taoist Master Sun with tears swimming in his eyes, not even bothering to spare a glance at Bai Bai, who was at a complete loss for what to do or say. She didn't know if she should congratulate Jianqing or be sad for herself. Feng's mind was reeling, but he still had the presence of mind to extend a Taoist salute toward Taoist Master Sunday. However, it seemed like he didn't think this was a sufficient gesture to express his gratitude and veneration, so he also fell to his knees and kowtowed to Taoist Master Sun thrice in a row. After his third kowtow, he remained still with his forehead pressed against the ground, not daring to get up for fear that he would wake up from this glorious dream if he did so. Earlier in that study, the almighty old man had appeared before him and told him that he would take him as his first ever disciple. After that, the old man died, and now, he was being presented with the opportunity to become a disciple to Taoist Master Sun, someone clearly even more unfathomable than the old man. Feng couldn't help but wonder how much good karma he had to have accumulated in his past life to be granted such immense fortune. Feng chose not to reveal the underlying reasons to Taoist Master Sunday. These things were always better revealed later rather than sooner. His junior brother had once traveled the world in straw sandals, and with a bamboo hiking pole, just like Feng. However, he had ultimately met an untimely demise from an all-out sword strike unleashed by the Taoist second disciple from the White Jade capital. The entire heavenly world praised his junior brother for dying a hero's death. After all, not just anyone was worthy of taking an all-out attack from the Taoist second disciple. Taoist Master Sun paid no heed to these flippant remarks disguised as praise. This was the reason why that great demon had taken an interest in Feng. It wasn't because he was truly sentimental toward Taoist Master Sun's junior brother. Instead, he simply wanted to accumulate some good karma for himself. As for Lu Guibao and Jianqing, Taoist Master Sun had offered to take them on as disciples on a whim, solely as red herrings to disguise the fact that Feng was the only one he was actually interested in. Of course, for those two, this was still a massive opportunity. As for what they could make of this opportunity, that would be up to them. And the same applied to Feng as well. Furthermore, as it turned out, the Rainbow Sparrow residence and Peach Blossom Fairy Station where Lu Guibao resided had some slight connection to Taoist Master Sun's Sword Immortal branch. Even the most trivial of connections were still connections nevertheless. The Tao hearts of the trio could be slowly polished over time. Their current cultivation bases varied quite drastically, but it was really yet to be seen which one of them would ultimately become the most accomplished of the three. Lu Guibao was very hesitant. Sun Qing attempted to communicate with her through her mind's lake, telling her that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and that she would sorely regret it if she passed up the opportunity. In the next instant, Sun Qing was sent flying back through the air like a cannonball. Blood was trickling out of all of her orifices, and it was clear from her expression that she was in some agony. Taoist Master Sun turned to Lu Guibao, then shook his head as he evaluated. "You possess superior aptitude to Jianqing, but your temperament is lacking. What a pity." Lu Guibao's heart instantly sank, and she couldn't help but burst into tears. However, she continued to grit her teeth in silence, refusing to sob out loud. Sun Qing struggled to her feet, and she wanted to tell Lu Guibao to reconsider, to tell that she was being evicted from the ancestral hall by the head of the Rainbow Sparrow residence, so she wasn't betraying the Rainbow Sparrow residence by accepting Taoist Master Sun as her master. And so what even if she was betraying the Rainbow Sparrow residence? She could easily live 1,000 lifetimes without being blessed with another fated opportunity of this magnitude. On the path of cultivation, There were truly many fated opportunities that only came around once, and if they were missed, then they would never present themselves again in any subsequent lifetimes. Taoist Master Sun took an intrigued glance at Sun Qing as he remarked, "You have a fine temperament, but your aptitude is too lackluster. Even if you're lucky, you'll only reach the nascent tier at most." It was a rather hurtful assessment, but it was the truth. "I'll be taking only 2 people with me then," Taoist Master Sun concluded. Diyuan Feng Zhanqing, you can both stand up now. There's no need to observe these pedantic formalities when you're with me. After that, Taoist Master Sun raised a hand, and the 2 halves of the unpolished jade tier great demon's body instantly appeared on the mountain summit. "You enjoy playing dead, do you? Where did you pick up this habit from?" The 2 halves of the body fused back into one, then knelt down onto the ground in silence. "My junior brother was the one who brought you onto the path of cultivation. People like us do not put much weight into grudges and grievances, but it's still a little disheartening to see that even a lowly beast like you doesn't know the importance of gratitude," Taoist Master Sun sneered. The great demon began trembling in fear. "I was unable to save my junior brother all those years, but there are still some things that I can do for him," Taoist Master Sun continued. "Do you enjoy playing with the hearts of others when you don't even know your own heart? You're like some splashing mud onto others while sitting in a puddle of mud yourself. How laughable. You were with my junior brother for so many years and read so many works from the 3 teachings and 100 schools of thought during that time, but it's clearly all gone to waste. You only have a surface-level understanding of what it means to pursue the truth, yet you're completely oblivious to the essence of what it means to be careful." Taoist Master Sun gently rested a hand on top of the great demon's head, and the latter didn't even have a chance to struggle or cry out before both his body and soul were erased from existence. In the wake of his demise, 2 things popped out before falling to the ground, namely a tattered book and a tablet minimization treasure. Taoist Master Sun merely took a glance at the 2 items before looking away and beckoning to a certain direction with a smile. At the same time, the 5 people who had just been awakened returned to the river of time, but they were completely oblivious. Chen Ping'an instantly used his land-shortening mystical ability to arrive on the mountain summit, having already reverted back to his true appearance. There was no need for him to disguise himself any longer. "It looks like you've already made quite a few trips through the river of time," Taoist Master Sun remarked with a hint of surprise in his voice. "Not that many, but cumulatively speaking, I've been in the river of time for quite some time," Chen Ping'an answered in a truthful manner. "If you've already had a chance to witness the scenery at the top, then you should learn to cherish what you have," Taoist Master Sun said with a smile. "Don't be an insolent little brat like that Huai Qian. Even the average mortal knows to put up door gods to ward off evil spirits, yet he was constantly going around courting death. I even tolerated the fact that the sword chi left behind by my junior brother had taken a liking to him, but whenever I see someone determined to die, I always make sure to grant them their wish." A hesitant look appeared on Chen Ping'an's face. "You want to ask about that Huang Shi, right?" Taoist Master Sun asked. "He doesn't count as someone courting death. He's just struggling to survive like most other people. In my eyes, you and Huang Shi live life the same way. It's just that you 2 are going down different paths. As for whether one of your paths is loftier than the other, that's not for me to say. The key to a path doesn't lie in how lofty it is. Instead, it's how far it can take you." Chen Ping'an had no further trivial questions to ask, but there was an important question that he really wanted to raise. "You place too much emphasis on good and evil and actions and karma, but at the same time you don't have a deep enough understanding of these concepts, and that's why you find yourself so exhausted all the time. There are many things that you can do, but most of them will be in futility. The world is not a dead and inanimate thing. It will naturally correct certain things on its own. However, once you reach a sufficient cultivation base, there will arise a slight chance that you'll be able to make some minute differences in the state of the world. The more you think about it, the more powerless you feel, right? That's how you should feel. The vast majority of us are powerless to make a true difference in the world, but there are many people in the 3 worlds right now who seem oblivious to this, whether it be through willful ignorance or otherwise." A dejected look appeared on Chen Ping'an's face upon hearing this. "It seems like you're still not quite there in your mental cultivation, fellow cultivator Chan," Taoist Master Sun jibed, then swept a sleeve through the air, and a bunch of natural treasures and immortal artifacts were reduced to the size of mustard seeds before flying into the miniature world in his sleeve. Even the treasures in Huan Yun's possession, and in the pocket treasure of the old Cloudtop City guest elder flew out on their own before drifting obediently up Taoist Master Sun's sleeve. At the same time, the Taoist Master Sun that had fallen to the ground disintegrated into nothingness. It was a young soul avatar that he had always intended to get rid of. That body was the vessel for all of his karmic ties from the majestic world, and he had no intention of taking it with him. All that remained of the mountain of treasures beside the ruins of the Taoist temple on the mountain summit were a few straggling bags. In the next instant, everyone vanished from the mountain summit before reappearing on the vacant area outside the arched bridge. All of the landmarks of the small world had been drawn up Taoist Master Sun's sleeve, including the bodies of water and the many mountains that had been diligently refined by the great demon. All of a sudden, the small world was made to appear very vast and empty. Aside from everything you've already obtained, I will leave all of the remaining fated opportunities on the mountain here, Taoist Master Sun said with a smile. Once they regain their senses, everything will return to normal, and they can continue fighting or do whatever they please. Huai Qian's body had already disappeared, along with the azure talisman and the golden ball. A Taoist book that was rippling with treasured light flew out before drawing to a halt in midair in front of Lu Guibao. You were not meant to become my disciple, but I'm still going to gift you this book. Sun Qing had also received a fated opportunity in the form of that badge minimization treasure. Chen Ping'an wanted to say something, but seemed rather hesitant. Taoist Master Sun took an amused glance at him, and in the next instant, the two bags that he had buried on the mountain earlier appeared beside him. Even for someone as shameless as Chen Ping'an, he couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed, but he didn't hesitate in the slightest before crouching down to pick up the bags. It seems like you're doing very well both as a vagrant cultivator and a traveling salesman, fellow cultivator Chan, Taoist Master Sun remarked. I'll take your word for it, Taoist Master Sun, Chen Ping'an hurriedly replied. Perhaps a cultivator of Taoist Master Sun's caliber had the ability to speak things into existence, so Chen Ping'an was eager to accept his blessings. In any case, it couldn't hurt, and perhaps he could even gain something from it. Taoist Master Sun seemed rather intrigued by Chen Ping'an, and he smiled as he mused, your mental state is even shoddier and more dilapidated than your barely mended bridge of immortality. Are you really a chi refiner aiming for immortality? I don't mean to talk down to you just because my cultivation base is superior to yours, but you truly are a complete mess. You possess a great Tao, but there are far too many divergent paths branching away from it, making for an exceptionally arduous and confounding journey ahead. If you keep walking down this path, even if you become a sword immortal of the majestic world, it'll be very difficult for you to sever the threads of karma with your sword. Instead, the threads will only become more tangled and chaotic the more you try. I'll just have to take things one step at a time, Chen Ping'an replied with a wry smile. You don't think it's unfair? Taoist Master Sun asked. Chen Ping'an considered the question for a moment then replied, I think these hardships are only to be expected. Taoist Master Sun nodded in response, then casually swept a sleeve through the air. The cloud and mist around him instantly became scattered and chaotic, then gradually fell still again, following which he asked, Has the state of the world changed? Chen Ping'an remained silent as he carefully pondered the deep meaning behind the question. Taoist Master Sun stomped a foot down, causing the earth to tremble as he asked, You must be thinking that the state of the world has surely changed at least a little by now, right? Chen Ping'an thought back to what Taoist Master Sun had said earlier about how the world could naturally correct certain things on its own, and he asked, Then what should we do? The principles that Taoist Master Sun was espousing actually went against the fundamental ideas that Chen Ping'an had firmly believed in, but he still wanted to ask more questions and hear what Taoist Master Sun had to say. That's correct. Taoist Master Sun praised with a pleased nod. Chen Ping'an was perplexed. He had no idea what he had gotten correct. However, Taoist Master Sun offered no explanation as he continued. You're not going to ask who was the one that managed to kill my junior brother? I wouldn't dare to ask, and even if you told me, I wouldn't dare to listen, Chen Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. Very good, Taoist Master Sun praised with a nod. If you're not going to ask me anything, then it's my turn to ask you something. What does it mean to be careful as a cultivator? This time, Qian Ping'an didn't hesitate at all as he replied. It means to harbor a sense of awe and veneration to the world and to regard oneself as one's greatest enemy. Well, you've certainly covered all of your bases. Taoist Master Sun chuckled. You've addressed both the greater world around you and the small world that is yourself. Who taught you such a broad principle? I figured it out myself, Qian Ping'an replied. Just as you said, principles that are too broad lose all meaning. There are many small things that support this principle that I don't do well enough. Taoist Master Sun couldn't help but be reminded of his junior brother. Back then, his junior brother had very similar ideas to Qian Ping'an. He always said that the Great Tao was too vast and broad, and that particular attention had to be paid to the minor details. Otherwise, as the state of the world changed over time, not only would the foundation of one's Great Tao begin to waver, even the white jade capital would eventually collapse, and the loftier it was constructed, the more catastrophic its collapse would be. No one was particularly opposed to his view of the world, so that was never a problem. The issue Taoist Master Sun's junior brother was that he was a key figure in the Sword Immortal branch, but he had gone out of his way to stick his nose into many things that he had no business getting involved in. Outside of all of the monumental feats that he had achieved, there was one relatively minor thing that he had also been doing on the side. The great demon that enjoyed refining mountains had actually become host to a heavenly demon, but was completely oblivious to it himself. Taoist Master Sun's junior brother had attempted to get rid of the heavenly demon, but in doing so, he had drawn the ire of a certain short-tempered individual from the White Jade capital, ultimately leading to his demise. Then there was Song Maolu, the final disciple that his junior brother had taken under his wing. Even in the eyes of Taoist Master Sun, Song Maolu had been an outstanding prodigy, and he had founded a Taoist branch similar to Mount Longhu of the Middle Earth Divine Continent. However, he had also ultimately suffered a rather unfortunate fate. In contrast, Song Maolu's disciples had all been doing quite well at the time that Taoist Master Sun left the heavenly world, and they had managed to continue the lineage of the Taoist branch. In the heavenly world, the three branch masters of the White Jade capital under the Tao ancestor took turns overseeing the White Jade capital, and it was often the case that the world was most stable and peaceful when the Tao ancestor's eldest disciple was in charge. Whenever Lu Chun was given that responsibility, the heavenly world would become a very chaotic place, but one that was thriving with vitality. As for whenever the Taoist second disciple was in charge, there would always be a huge number of casualties among the upper 5-tier cultivators of the world, not just outside of the White Jade capital, but within it as well. Taoist Master Sun scanned his gaze over his surroundings, then extended a hand to draw out a tiny green flame from the glabellas of everyone around him. He then smiled as he said, "There are certain things that you would be better off not knowing about. I have erased everyone's memories from the moment Huai Qian began seeking his demise. I'm going to leave some treasures and fated opportunities behind for all of you. And that's likely going to be a double-edged sword. It'll be a blessing for sure, but there's also a very good chance that it'll spark another round of conflict. Are you going to intervene to try and mitigate the conflict?" "There's no need for my intervention," Qian Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. "I'm just going to be a passive observer." Taoist Master Sun nodded in response, and the tattered book on the ground drifted over Qian Ping'an as he said, "In that case, take this opportunity to further observe the hearts of those around you. One man's trash is another man's treasure. In the hands of someone else, this book wouldn't be worth much at all, but it'll be very useful for you." Qian Ping'an tucked the book up his sleeve as he expressed his gratitude. "There is no one more qualified to speak on those pursuing the Great Tao than a Taoist," Taoist Master Sun said with a smile. "The Great Tao is a vast and complex thing, young man. It'll be worth your while to observe and learn from it as much as possible." "I will," Qian Ping'an replied with a nod. "So what are your plans now? Are you going to continue your treasure hunting journey?" Taoist Master Sun asked with a smile. "I think I'll pass for now," Qian Ping'an replied with an awkward expression. Huai Qian had encountered Taoist Master Sun on this occasion, and there was no telling who Qian Ping'an could encounter next time. "There's no need to overthink things after I leave," Taoist Master Sun continued. "Just do whatever you believe should be done. Everyone has entered this place to fight for fated opportunities at their own risk, so it's up to them to bear the consequences. Chen Ping'an began to consider how he wanted to wrap things up here, but he was rather perplexed by Taoist Master Sun as the latter continued to observe him with a smile, as if he were expecting something from him. In the end, Taoist Master Sun repeated in a joking tone, "Looks like your determination to pursue the great Tao is still lacking, fellow cultivator Chen." Chen Ping'an was instantly enlightened and he replied, "The path ahead is long and arduous." Taoist Master Sun stroked his beard with a smile and a nod, looking very pleased. In a few more minutes' time, the flow of time in this small world will return to normal. Taoist Master Sun drew Diyuan Feng and Zhan Qing into the world within his sleeve, then raced away as a streak of light. As soon as the streak of light that was Taoist Master Sun crashed into the heavens of the small world, a huge hole was instantly blasted into the sky, and the hole slowly expanded as the surrounding restrictions dissipated. However, after the streak of white light left the small world, everything returned to normal in the blink of an eye. Chen Ping'an stared after Taoist Master Sun for a moment, then immediately turned and ran. With a conflict imminent, he decided that it was best to get far away from this place. As for the treasure-bearing bags on the ground, he didn't even bother to spare them a glance, but that didn't mean that he wasn't going to return for them once everything was said and done. Several minutes was more than enough for Chen Ping'an to flee the scene, and as the flow of time returned to normal, he couldn't help but wonder where Huang Shi and Jin Shan were. While rushing away from the mountain summit, he stopped by the caisson ceiling to discover that it was still situated where it had always been, and it was still abundant with spiritual energy. Unfortunately, it was yet another treasure that he wouldn't be able to take away with him. Actually, who says I can't take this with me? The restrictions in this small world are already gone, so it's not out of the question. It's just going to take a bit of effort. With that in mind, he quickly dug up the soil around the millstone-sized caisson ceiling before pulling it out of the ground and rushing away with it on his back. Prior to doing so, he made sure to plaster a steel-carrying talisman to his forehead. A vertically adhered talisman could obstruct one's view, so it was much better to plaster a talisman horizontally across one's forehead. This was a nugget of wisdom that he had learned from Pei Qian. High up in the sky of the majestic world, Taoist Master Sun turned back to take a glance at the small world below, then chuckled. He really doesn't leave anything behind. Standing beside him was an old Confucian scholar with a golden jade tablet hanging from his waist, and he said, "You may leave now." "In that case, open the door," Taoist Master Sun replied with a smile. Somewhere in the northern pavilion nation, Huan Yun, Sun Qing, and Bai Bai were the first to return to their senses, and they all looked around in a momentary daze before hurriedly examining their bonded items while stabilizing the spiritual energy in their key acupoints. Sun Qing immediately tucked the badge up her sleeve, and with Lu Guibao still in a daze, Sun Qing took that Dao book from her for temporary safekeeping. She had lost all memory of what had just transpired, but these treasures were there for the taking. If she didn't even dare to claim these treasures that were dangling right before her, then she may as well retire as a cultivator. "It seems like we've somehow already left the immortal abode," Huan Yun mused with tightly furrowed brows. At the same time, he was stunned to discover that his pocket treasure, which had previously been loaded with spoils, had almost been completely emptied. Meanwhile, Lu Guibao was searching for Huai Qian, but the latter was obviously nowhere to be seen. She couldn't help but grit her teeth in resentment at the thought of how he had deceived her this entire time. Bai Bai was also looking around with a confused expression, wondering where Zhan Qing had gone. Out of everyone, Lu Guibao was the first to discover the bags laying on the ground, and she immediately identified them as fated opportunities to be fought over. However, in the next instant, Bai Bai had also caught sight of those bags, while Gao Ling had only just returned to his senses. Lu Guibao teamed up with Sun Qing, while Bai Bai joined forces with Gao Ling, and each of them secured a hefty bag that was filled with treasures from the immortal abode. Both sides were quite apprehensive of one another, so no conflict broke out. As for the final bag, that was left to the Dragon Gate tier vagrant cultivator and the martial arts master to fight over. Both of them sprang onto the bag at once, instantly tearing it into two, and the treasures inside spilled all over the ground. There were over 10 treasures in total, and each of them grabbed a few, while the rest were claimed by Huan Yun, Sun Qing, and Bai Bai. It seemed that everyone was content to split the treasures peacefully and avoid a conflict. Everyone else who was fortunate enough to have survived to this point immediately fled the scene. This foray into the immortal abode had been a far more perilous trip than they had bargained for, and they were all eager to flee while they still could. After claiming his share of the bags of treasures, Huan Yun immediately flew up into the air while a stream of talismans shot out of each of his sleeves. He was simultaneously examining his surroundings, while also verifying the safety of Shenzhen's two direct disciples. On top of that, once the Dragon Gate tier guest elder of Cloudtop City noticed that the surrounding restrictions had been undone, he would be sure to flee with that white jade brush pocket treasure, and he presumably wouldn't be returning to the Sacred Lotus Nation or Cloudtop City before he reached at least the Golden Core tier. Thankfully, Huan Yun was able to quickly locate Shenzhen's direct disciples several kilometers away, and both of them were unharmed. At the same time, a flying sword talisman that had already raced to several dozen kilometers away was abruptly shattered by someone. Huan Yun sneered as he immediately set off in that direction, and in the end, he was able to intercept the guest elder with ease. "You're going to kill me, is that it?" Guest elder Su yelled in an enraged manner. "No, I'm going to take you back to Cloudtop City and have you face City Lord Shenzhenza," Huan Yun replied. The old guest elder raised the pocket treasure, which was clutched tightly in his hand, and he threatened, "I'm going to destroy this thing if you come any closer." Both the Dao robe and that of immortal remains are very sturdy objects, so there's a very good chance that they'll remain unscathed even if you detonate the pocket treasure, Huan Yun said in an indifferent manner. "However, if you do that, then I'll kill you on the spot. After that, I'll just have to go and see Shenzhenza on my own and explain to him what happened." "I'm not going back to Cloudtop City with you, Huan Yun," the old guest elder said with a hint of finality in his voice. "I know what Shenzhenza is like. If I fall into his hands, I'll be subjected to a fate worse than death." "Then why did you do all of this?" Huan Yun snapped. "If you hadn't allowed your greed to get the better of you, then you would be greeted with a hero's welcome upon your return to Cloudtop City. I can hand over this pocket treasure to you, but in return, you have to give me all of your land-shortening talismans," the old guest elder negotiated. "Also, you have to tell Shenzhenza and his two disciples that you've already killed me." "I can do that," Huan Yun replied without any hesitation, then pulled out a stack of talismans before fanning them out slightly for the old guest elder to see. All of them were land-shortening talismans, and there were even 2 golden talismans among them. "This is your last chance," Huan Yun warned. "If you dare to try any funny business, then I won't hesitate to put an end to your life." Huan Yun tossed his talismans forward in the very same instant that the guest elder released the pocket treasure, and as soon as the guest elder caught the talismans, he immediately used up one of the golden ones, transporting himself to several dozen kilometers away in the blink of an eye. Huan Yun heaved a faint sigh, then made his way to Shenzhen's 2 direct disciples and handed the pocket treasure over to them. At the same time, he honored his agreement with guest elder Su, informing the 2 disciples that the old guest elder was already dead. The young man carefully accepted the pocket treasure with trembling hands, then tucked it up his sleeve before extending a grateful bow toward Huan Yun with tears streaming down his face. "How could we ever repay you, Senior Huan? You have saved our lives and recovered our lost treasures. Words cannot express my gratitude." The young woman had already erupted into sobs with her hands clasped over her face. She had thought that the immortal abode would surely be her final resting place, and the entire ordeal had been a nightmarish experience that she would never forget. Huan Yun smiled as he advised, "Right now you're a decent distance away from everyone else, so take this opportunity and leave this place right away. Make sure you keep the treasures that you obtained a secret once you return to Cloudtop City." Huan Yun was naturally going to explore the area again to see if he could find any treasures that had slipped through the cracks. Following the departure of the young pair, Huan Yun fell into a contemplative silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something, but he couldn't put his finger on exactly what was giving him this feeling. The old guest elder had to have forced the young man to tell him how to open the pocket treasure. However, Huan Yun was certain that the guest elder hadn't pulled the set of immortal remains out of the pocket treasure and hidden it elsewhere, nor had he pulled out the Dao robe and hidden it somewhere on his body. Hence, this ordeal had undoubtedly resulted in a net loss for the old guest elder. All he had received for his efforts was a stack of talismans, but he had lost his position as the head guest elder of Cloudtop City. All of a sudden, a look of realization appeared on Huan Yun's face, followed by a wry smile. He had finally figured out what he had been missing this entire time. A bunch of treasures and artifacts had mysteriously gone missing from his pocket treasure, so there was a very good chance that the same thing had happened to the white jade brush pocket treasure. What if one or both of the set of immortal remains and the Dao robe had gone missing? What would Shen Zhenzi think? With that in mind, a forlorn look appeared on Huan Yun's face. The young man was a fine cultivation prospect, both in aptitude and temperament. It was just a pity that he had been killed by guest elder Su. Huan Yun had failed in his duty as Dao Guardian and was only able to deliver a pocket treasure back to Cloudtop City. With his mind made up, a cold look appeared in his eyes as he set off in pursuit after the young duo. He was hoping that one of the two aforementioned treasures was still in the pocket treasure. In any case, he would return the pocket treasure to Cloudtop City, but if there remained one of those two treasures, then he would claim it for himself. Bai Bai departed with Gao Ling and the imperial guest elder from the Sacred Lotus Nation, and all of them were looking rather grim. Zhan Qing had gone missing, while the guest elder of his clan had perished, and Bai Bai had a lot of explaining to do to multiple parties, namely Zhan Qing's father and nascent tier master, as well as the ancestral hall of the Water Dragon sect. Bai Bai could only hope that the treasures she had brought back with her would somewhat make up for this huge mess. "We can kill those two," Gao Ling said. "Indeed we can," Bai Bai replied with a smile. "You two can split the spoils evenly." Gao Ling condensed his voice into a line, communicating to Bai Ling in secret as he said, "His Majesty is going to ask a lot of questions, and your sect is most likely going to do the same. In that case, let's kill one more," Bai Bai said. Gao Ling offered no response. "If you do as I say, I will make you the foremost general of the Sacred Lotus Nation," Bai Bai enticed. Gao Ling hesitated momentarily, then suddenly said, "I want to occupy a position that only a martial artist can occupy, one that chi refiners would be unable to take from me. If I can gain such a position, then you'll have unmatched control over not just the Sacred Lotus Nation, but perhaps even the Celestial Water Nation and the Northern Pavilion Nation as well. You have a pretty big appetite, but I think you have the wherewithal to back up your ambitions," Bai Bai replied with a smile. In the next instant, the Sacred Lotus Nation guest elder was decapitated out of nowhere by a punch from Gao Ling, while Bai Bai's expression remained completely unchanged as she immediately incinerated the body into ashes. With the dust finally beginning to settle, it appeared that the Rainbow Sparrow residents had been the biggest winner in all of this. All three of their cultivators were alive and well, and they had claimed more than their fair share of treasures and fated opportunities. "That old man that appeared at the top of the scroll twice, he's not going to come and target our Rainbow Sparrow residents, is he?" Wu Kun suddenly asked. She had managed to identify Chan Ping'an thanks to his Dao robe. "I don't think that's a concern," Sun Qing replied with a smile. "No friend of Lu Jinglong's would be so unscrupulous." Wu Kun's concerns were not assuaged. At this point, Sun Qing had had a chance to take a close look at the Taoist book and the badge, and while the exact value of the former was still unclear to her, she had managed to identify the latter as a minimization treasure, something that was normally reserved only for cultivators of the upper 5 tiers. Following this ordeal, Wu Kun no longer trusted anyone other than Sun Qing and Lu Guibao. Ultimately, what she no longer had trust in was the state of the world and humanity as a whole. The reason why her distrust for everyone ran so deep was because a thought had arisen deep within her heart, one that she found both terrifying and shameful. She had posed a question to herself. If she possessed the same powers as Chan Ping'an, would she be able to resist the temptation of killing Sun Qing and Lu Guibao to take their fated opportunities? She didn't know the answer to that question, and she didn't dare to think too much about it. Deep in a deserted area in the mountains, Chan Ping'an concealed the caisson ceiling at the bottom of a pond. From there, he took off all of his Dao robes in exchange for normal robes, and he hoisted his trusty bamboo case onto his back with only 4 bags inside. After walking for a few kilometers, he discovered a familiar figure standing on a tall branch on a tree beside the mountain path. The man had a giant bag on his back, and it was none other than Huang Shi. "I know it's you," Huang Shi said with a smile. "And yet you chose not to run away?" Chan Ping'an asked. "Honestly, I don't really even understand it myself, But for some reason, after leaving that strange place, I feel safer and more at ease with you, Brother Chun," Huang Shi replied with a smile. At this point, Huang Shi had already lost all confidence in his ability to assess the cultivation bases of those around him. The only thing that he still had some modicum of confidence in was his ability to tell a good person from a bad one. "Just stay out of my way and let's go our separate paths," Chen Ping'an said. "We're both very fortunate to have come out of that place alive, and we shouldn't push our luck any further." Huang Shi adjusted the enormous bag on his back, then said, "You're clearly an expert at this, given all the ways you have to disguise yourself in your cultivation base. Unfortunately, I'm nowhere near as competent. Bai Bai and Gao Ling may come after me at some point, and with all these treasures that I'm carrying, there's a pretty good chance I won't make it out of the Northern Pavilion Nation alive." "You were talking about revenge earlier. What's that about?" Chen Ping'an asked. "Back in my youth I was very reckless and hot-headed, and I'll admit that I did something wrong. However, instead of punishing me for my transgressions, my enemies went after my family. They killed every single member of my family, over 40 people, including the women, the children, and the elderly, and all of them were skinned before having their skins swapped with one another, just to further desecrate their bodies." Huang Shi retold this harrowing story with a tone of complete detachment and indifference, as if he were only relaying a story that he had heard about someone else. It was often the case that after experiencing true pain, one would no longer yell and scream and display the reactions expected of them. Instead, they would go quiet and become more withdrawn, almost as if they were numb to it all. Chen Ping'an remained silent. "Regardless of who you are, you seem more trustworthy than the others to me," Huang Shi continued. "I've been pushing my luck this entire time, and it's paid off so far, so why not push it a little further and go all in one final time? I'm willing to sell the majority of the treasures in my bag to you for immortal coins, so I can save up for a military and armor pellet. Of course, I'm not going to be able to afford a suit of divine dew-bearing armor. Instead, I'll just have to settle for a suit of golden crow armor. After that, I'll buy a Dao saber that I've had my eyes on for quite some time, and from there, I'll finally be able to do something that I should have done a long time ago." Chen Ping'an pulled several steel-carrying talismans out of his sleeve, then tossed them at Huang Shi as he said, "These talismans will allow you to conceal your aura. As a Vajrabadi tier martial artist, you'll be able to make even better use of them than most. As long as you're careful and only travel at night, these should be enough to allow you to sneak out of the Northern Pavilion Nation." A look of surprise and caution appeared on Huang Shi's face, and he didn't immediately reach out for the talismans. Back in the immortal abode, this was the same tactic that he had used to lure Chen Ping'an forward before punching him in the face. Of course, at the time, he had been trying to determine whether Chen Ping'an was hiding his power. Only when the talismans had drifted a safe distance away from Chen Ping'an did Huang Shi finally draw them into his grasp, and after a brief silence he asked, "Why are you doing this? What do you stand to gain?" At this point, Chen Ping'an had already departed and he replied, "I just want to live in a world where all of us dare to speak and act against the injustices that we witness." It was a very casual and nonchalant response from Chen Ping'an, but even for a ruthless and cold-hearted martial artist like Huang Shi, he was shaken to the core, and his grip unconsciously tightened around the talismans in his hand. After taking a deep breath, he wiped a hand over his own face, then suddenly called, "Please wait a moment, Brother Chan. What more do you want from me?" Chen Ping'an snapped as he turned around with a furious expression. "I barely have any talismans left myself. I'm just a hard-working traveling salesman who has to earn his money one snowflake coin at a time, just like everyone else. Do I look like some type of philanthropist to you? How dare you try and ask for more? Have you no shame? Have you forgotten what you did to me earlier? That punch had me seeing stars. You should count yourself fortunate that I'm letting it slide." Huang Shi briefly considered changing his mind, but in the end, he shook his head with a wry smile before undoing one corner of his bag and pulling out 3 items from inside, all of which he tossed at Chen Ping'an as he said, "I wouldn't count myself as a good person at all, but I'm also not a fan of owing favors to others." The furious look on Chen Ping'an's face immediately turned to a gleeful smile, and he accepted the 3 items before placing them into his bamboo case, then proposed that the 2 of them sit down over some wine to discuss some business. Huang Shi immediately rejected his proposal. "Now that I have these talismans, I have no interest in doing any business with you. Given how shrewd and stingy you are, I'll surely be the one to come off second best. You're far too kind in your appraisal of my business acumen, Chun Ping'an said with a humble smile. And with that, the two of them parted ways. Can you tell me your name? Is that too much to ask? Huang Shi suddenly asked. Not at all, Chun Ping'an replied without even turning his head. My name is Chun Haoran. Huang Shi could only roll his eyes in exasperation. Chun Haoran, my arse. However, he had to admit that Chun Ping'an really was a good person. All of a sudden, Chun Ping'an turned back around and rustled two thick stacks of talismans out of his sleeves with a serious expression as he said, Before you go, I actually have some more offensive talismans here, all of which are exceptional value for money. You should. Huang Shi had already plastered a steel-carrying talisman to his own body, and before Chun Ping'an had a chance to finish, he gave Chun Ping'an the middle finger before departing. It seems like everyone's too smart to take the bait nowadays. Chun Ping'an sighed with a disappointed shake of his head. Die. As Chun Ping'an made his way out of the mountains, he suddenly looked up right as a young man and a young woman abruptly flew out of the nearby undergrowth, seemingly in a real hurry, and in the blink of an eye, they had vanished out of sight. They were none other than Shenzhen's two direct disciples. The reason they were in such a hurry was because the young man had a really bad feeling in the pit of his stomach. Earlier, after the pocket treasure had been returned to him by Huan Yun, he had briefly inspected its contents to discover that it only contained several treasures that were completely unfamiliar to him. He presumed that these were treasures that guest Elder Su had gathered in the immortal abode, but the all-important Dao robe and immortal body were nowhere to be found. Huan Yun had told them that guest Elder Su was already dead. Was it possible that he had forced guest Elder Su to tell him how to open the pocket treasure, following which he had claimed those two priceless treasures for himself? In that case, why had Huan Yun returned the pocket treasure to him? Was it because he was confident that the young man wouldn't dare to tell his master about the two missing treasures? The young man couldn't figure out Huan Yun's intentions, but a seed of suspicion had been planted in his heart, and it left him doubting everything. The same applied to Huan Yun as well. In reality, both of them were good and intelligent people. Even though there had been a brief period of time in which Huan Yun had been tempted to kill the young duo and steal their treasures, he had ultimately chosen not to go against his own conscience. However, in the end, all of that was for naught, and he had ultimately succumbed to his more nefarious urges. It didn't take long for Huan Yun to catch up to the young pair, and he descended upon them with a cold expression as he asked, "What's the mantra required to open the pocket treasure?" The young man immediately positioned himself in front of his female companion to shield her as he asked, "Why ask a question you already know the answer to? Why would I ask you if I already knew?" Huan Yun snapped. "How am I supposed to know what unfathomable immortals like you are thinking?" the young man asked with a wry smile. Huan Yun gave the young pair a recount of what had happened. The young man was rather taken aback and he asked, "In that case, why are you asking me for the mantra to open the pocket treasure?" "I want you to understand why you're going to be killed here," Huan Yun replied. "We can defect from Cloudtop City and cultivate under you in exchange for our lives," the young man said. Huan Yun took a glance at the female companion behind the young man, then said in an expressionless manner, "You have to prove yourself first." "Ha! Some spiritual master you are, Huan Yun!" The young man scoffed with a derisive expression as he spat disdainfully onto the ground. "You're even worse than all those vagrant cultivators." All of a sudden, a small dagger was plunged into the young man's back from behind, and he stumbled forward before slowly turning around with a dazed expression. His female companion had already sprung back several dozen feet, and was trembling with a guilt-ridden expression. "Very good," Huan Yun praised with a pleased smile. The severely wounded young man stared at his guilt-ridden companion as tears began streaming down his face, but there was no anger or resentment in his eyes, only disappointment and sympathy. "There's no point. He's using you. Both of us still have to die here anyway. You've always been the smarter one of the two," Huan Yun chuckled, then turned to a certain direction as he asked, "Why were you hiding, fellow cultivator? You clearly planned to intervene, so why not show yourself?" Chun Ping'an emerged from behind a tree, then took a glance at the young woman, whose guilt and remorse were slowly morphing into hatred and rage. Thankfully, he had arrived in time before the young man met his demise. Chen Ping'an turned his gaze to Huan Yun as he greeted. Fancy meeting you here. Indeed, Su Xingjiu was already well aware of these matters. If Huan Yun were truly a moral and righteous person from head to toe, not harboring any personal desires or greed, then he wouldn't have rushed over to pursue him in Zhao Qingwan. Those who possessed great desire were intolerant and had a narrow mind, so narrow that the small and winding path could only fit a single person, themselves. Sticking to the facts, Su Xingjiu understood that he had also made big mistakes in his decisions before. When Huan Yun had handed over the white jade brush shaft at the time, he shouldn't have speculated on Huan Yun's intentions in the most negative light possible. After discovering the disappearance of the two paramount treasures, the immortal body and the Dao robe, from the pocket treasure, he shouldn't have kept this a secret either. He should have chosen to be open and honest instead. If Huan Yun had explained the complicated matters at that time, perhaps the relationship between them wouldn't be as strained as it was right now. In reality, however, the human heart and worldly matters were nowhere near as simple as this. Guest Elder Su of Cloudtop City had carried out an intricate and deadly plan, causing Su Xingjiu to jump at shadows as he became fearful and alert. Moreover, as their Dao guardian, Huan Yun's choice of inaction throughout the ordeal had in and of itself been a form of hidden killing intent. Indeed, his concealed killing intent had perhaps come in the form of using Guest Elder Su as a borrowed blade. Guest Elder Su would kill Su Xingjiu and Zhao Qingwan to snatch the treasures, allowing Huan Yun to be the ultimate victor who swooped in afterward. Moreover, his hands would be completely clean of the crime. Huan Yun was in no hurry to make a move. Seeing this, Chen Ping'an was in no hurry either. There were many situations in which many people would feel like they had no way of turning back. Contrary to their beliefs, however, there were indeed ways of turning back. Huan Yun was actually facing the most awkward situation right now. Cloudtop City's Su Xingjiu and Zhao Qingwan naturally needed to be disposed of, but how he should deal with that wandering merchant who liked to change his disguise all the time was a dilemma that was rife with dangers. This was because Huan Yun couldn't confirm that person's cultivation base. In fact, he couldn't even decipher whether that person was a qi refiner from the talismanic branch or a sword cultivator, the most troublesome type of person from the mountains. There could only be two possible outcomes when everything was finally revealed. Either Huan Yun was killed, causing him to finally understand the lofty cultivation base of his opponent, or the wandering merchant died at Huan Yun's hands, allowing him to enjoy great fortune as he obtained all of the fated opportunities and immortal treasures. If I remember correctly, the Taoist sect has always said that only cultivating one's longevity but not cultivating one's character is the first mistake of cultivation, Chen Ping'an suddenly remarked. That's easy for you to say, Huan Yun replied with a chuckle. It's precisely because this is easy for everyone to say that it's so difficult to actually adhere to. If one successfully adheres to this principle, then one would have obtained a paramount treasure, having moral and virtue as one's foundation. This pertained to the principles of joint cultivation of one's inner nature, vital force, and of the myriad spiritual forces. Those who attained great mastery would become the so-called seamless towers of the Taoist sect and revered untainted fruits of the Buddhist sect. Huan Yun shook his head and said, I'm aware that you're not very old, and I also know that you're not a member of the Taoist sect. That being the case, there's no need to speak in riddles and appear deep and intricate in front of me. Why don't the two of us discuss something more tangible, just like we did when discussing business at Cloudtop City's market? Chen Ping'an also shook his head, replying, the transaction between us won't be possible as long as you're still intent on killing these two people. Since we're speaking openly now, I'll say that old spiritual master hasn't truly committed any disastrous mistakes apart from developing greed and killing intent. However, are the treasures and fated opportunities in Su Xingjiu's pocket treasure more valuable than the Tao heart that you've cultivated and nurtured with difficulty for your entire life? Huan Yun couldn't help but chuckle in speechlessness, sighing and asking, What's this? You're going to rely on your tongue alone to convince me to stop. Spiritual Master Huan, I'm willing to give up all of the treasures in my pocket treasure in exchange for my life, Su Xingjiu said. After Spiritual Master Huan looks over them, I humbly ask that you leave a single treasure for us so that we have something to show our master. In addition, I'm willing to make a heavy vow using a secret technique of our ancestral hall. I, Su Xingjiu, won't say a single word about Spiritual Master Huan's actions, and spiritual master Huan will remain an esteemed guest of Cloudtop City in the future. In fact, spiritual master Huan can even become a guest elder of Cloudtop City. Su Xingjiu had already pulled the hidden blade out from his body, one that was still a token of love. He wiped the blood from the blade and placed it inside his sleeve, after which he casually wrapped his wound and ingested a precious pill from Cloudtop City. The wound wasn't on his back, but on his heart. However, Su Xingjiu didn't mind this. Chun Ping'an heaved a faint sigh. The smarter Su Xingjiu appeared right now, able to assess the situation and see the bigger picture. The more of a hidden threat he would appear in Huan Yun's eyes. This couldn't be helped. That being the case, he could only use another method, one that was more in line with the style of the northern complete reed continent. Otherwise, Huan Yun would charge forward to commit murder, choosing to gamble big to win big. Two flying swords that were yet to be completely tempered into bonded items dashed out from two critical acupoints and hovered to the left and right of Chun Ping'an. One was slender and white, while the other was dark green. Huan Yun, do you insist on making mistake after mistake? Chun Ping'an asked. Huan Yun's sleeves billowed and expanded, with countless talismans hovering out to form a protection formation around him as he exclaimed in a quivering voice. You're the person who released his sword together with Lu Jinglong at the Sacred Lotus Nation? What do you think? Chun Ping'an asked. No wonder. Huan Yun heaved a long sigh and said. Chun Ping'an turned to Su Xingjiu and asked, what are you going to do now? Senior, I'll bring my junior sister back to Cloudtop City, Su Xingjiu replied. Zhao Qingwan sobbed and shouted, I'm not going. Just kill me, Su Xingjiu. Su Xingjiu smiled tragically and said, let's stop doing stupid things, okay? There's no hurdle that we can't overcome. Qingwan, if you trust me, then leave this place with me. Whatever our relationship was like in the past, it will still be the same in the future. I don't have anything gnawing at my mind, so as long as you're able to untie the knot in your heart as well, then everything will be the same as before. In fact, things might become even better. Qingwan, everyone makes mistakes, so don't be afraid. We'll learn from our mistakes and do better in the future. However, it was as if Zhao Qingwan were possessed, with her face as pale as a sheet and the rims of her eyes bright red as she murmured in reply, I can't go back. There's already no way for me to go back. Either you kill me or I'll kill you. Otherwise, we can die together and become husband and wife in our next life. We'll definitely love and cherish each other forever. Okay, Su Xingjiu. Su Xingjiu was expressionless as he retrieved the hidden knife and lightly tossed it to Zhao Qingwan. He then looked around at the dense forest surrounding them, smiling in self-deprecation and replying, couples are like birds from the same forest, yet they each fly their own way when great calamity befalls. However, we've already experienced this even though we haven't even become Dao partners yet. Qingwan, you can stab me again. Otherwise, I'll bring you back to Cloudtop City even if that means having to tie you up. I already said before that I would become Dao partners with you in this life. And I, Su Xingjiu, am a man of my word. Zhao Qingwan held onto the hidden knife and dazedly stared at Su Xingjiu. She suddenly started to smile, with tears still streaming down her face as her lips moved slightly and seemingly mouthed 3 words in silence. Su Xingjiu's vision became blurry with tears. It had always been like this. He had always been most fond of her eyes that could speak. When his master brought a young girl to Cloudtop City back then, the young boy had looked at her, and the young girl had cocked her head and looked back with her round eyes wide open. The young boy had pulled a face. The young girl had immediately burst into tears in fright. Year after year, they had lived together amid the lofty sea of clouds. Zhao Qingwan furiously drove the knife into her chest. Su Xingjiu arrived in front of her the next moment, grabbing the bloody hilt of the hidden knife with his hand. He smiled and said in a gentle voice, Qingwan, both of us have essentially died once now, so can we start from the beginning again now? Zhao Qingwan let go of the blade and squatted down on the ground, covering her face with her hands. Su Xingjiu tossed the hidden knife away and squatted down beside her, gently holding her in an embrace. He was just about to pat her back, yet upon seeing the fresh blood on his palm, he turned his hand around and lightly rubbed her back in a tender manner, murmuring, Don't be scared. Didn't you always complain about me not saying that I liked you back then? There's no need to ask this again in the future. After all, what man will express their sincere love all the time? There was a complicated expression on Huan Yun's face. Huan Yun, I believe you've left a child behind at Cloudtop City? Chen Ping'an asked. Don't drag my family into this mess. Huan Yun exclaimed in rage. I'm planning to learn from you and eliminate all possible future hindrances, Chen Ping'an replied. Are you forcing me to go down the path of mutual destruction? Huan Yun asked. Are you worthy? Chen Ping'an asked in response. It was as if Huan Yun aged 100 years in an instant, appearing geriatric as he conceded. So be it. My lofty reputation has been ruined in an instant. From today onward, I won't take a single step into Cloudtop City, and it will also be a consequence of my own actions regardless of how Su Xingjiu and Shen Zhenze target me in the future. Chen Ping'an shook his head and said, It doesn't matter whether you see me as a good person or a bad person. However, it would be best that you don't take me for a fool. Huan Yun gritted his teeth and spat. What in the world do you want? Are you truly hell-bent on killing my grandson? Is this how it is? I refuse to believe that you can act on this threat. Chen Ping'an cut Huan Yun off and said slowly, I'll accompany you on a journey to examine your conscience. Huan Yun was completely dumbfounded. Do you have a talismanic boat? Chen Ping'an asked. It's best that we take a boat together back to Cloudtop City. In the end, two precious talismanic boats that were as large as mortal ships slowly rose into the sky, sailing toward Cloudtop City. One talismanic boat carried 4 passengers, while the other carried a gigantic caisson sealing that someone had retrieved from a deep pool. Moreover, Huan Yun had placed illusion talismans on both of the incredibly valuable talismanic boats. Su Xingjiu and Zhao Qingwan sat side by side on one end of the talismanic boat. Meanwhile, Chen Ping'an and Huan Yun sat opposite each other on the other end of the boat. Chen Ping'an was sitting cross-legged, with his back resting against his large bamboo bookcase as he turned his head and said to the young woman, You need to cherish this kindness and goodwill that's not easy to come by. When interacting with each other in the future, this event should serve as a warning to the two of you, and you shouldn't try to avoid talking about it on purpose. Otherwise, you're bound to face more troubles in the future, and that will be a tragic moment when you wish you could have died earlier. If both of you can overcome this mental barrier, then you and Su Xingjiu can become genuine immortal Dao partners at that time. There are hundreds upon thousands of different hardships and challenges on the path of the great Dao, with examining one's heart and conscience being the most difficult. Perhaps this is a tribulation pertaining to mental cultivation that the two of you were fated to come across. As for whether you can obtain fortune from this misfortune, this depends on whether or not you're willing to properly contemplate the gains and losses pertaining to this tribulation. Chen Ping'an then turned to Su Xingjiu and said, Even if you truly don't mind today's events, her wrongdoings can't be swept under the rug because of this. Her significant wrongdoings will remain just that. So don't use empty and meaningless words to console her, Su Xingjiu. You need to properly understand these matters yourself first, or else you'll only cause her to feel increasingly guilty and ashamed, feeling like she isn't worthy of you. At that time, the two of you will either become enemies again, or you'll gradually drift further apart and become like strangers to each other. To put things bluntly, Su Xingjiu, it's ultimately the case that you haven't done well enough. This can't be helped. Since you want to act like a good person, you'll naturally have to pay a corresponding price. Su Xingjiu held Zhao Qingwan's hand and nodded with a smile. It was as if his mental state were welcoming a glimmer of hope after a difficult period, with the skies clear and blue after a grueling storm. He could vaguely sense that he was about to break through that barrier. Zhao Qingwan was seemingly able to untie some other knots in her heart after hearing this. Her grip on Su Xingjiu's hand became a bit firmer. Huan Yun remained silent the entire time, keeping his eyes closed as he rested his mind. Since Chen Ping'an had made clear his identity as the so-called sword immortal who had released his sword together with Qi Jinglong, there was no need to purposely conceal his appearance any longer. He tore off his face mask, revealing his true appearance under the guise of the young man. He then put on his 100-eye Taotai Dao robe, which was currently brimming with spiritual energy. Afterward, Su Xingjiu proposed a strategy to deal with the current situation, one that would neither be detrimental to his master, Shen Zhenze, nor be damaging to the vested interests of Cloudtop City. At the same time, spiritual master Huan Yun could also safeguard his good reputation. In fact, there would even be an unexpected but completely reasonable explanation for Su Xingjiu's wounds. This was a flawless and logical strategy. Chen Ping'an didn't have any objections. Huan Yuan simply nodded lightly in response, still not opening his eyes.